it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. The Roadside Slayings. Chapter 1. And so essentially, when we look at the psychology of sexual violence, the perpetrator isn't aroused because they find the victim sexually attractive. No, the act of sexual sadistic torture or rape is all about power. It's about elevating the perpetrator above his victim by degrading and dehumanizing them. Any questions at this time? I looked out into the auditorium, waiting to see if any hands went up. A few did. I picked one at the back, always did. It was harder to hear the lectures on the back row. If you weren't paying 100% attention, then you were clueless. People in the front of the room could doodle, text, and daydream and still take in 80% of what I said. Questions from the back were always good ones. I gave the young blonde student a cue to ask a question. So why does the perpetrator feel the need to dehumanize his victim? Why do they need to feel that power? She asked curiously, emphasizing key words that I had used. Well, based on years of research, theoretical and practical, as well as some of my own personal findings, then it's because the perpetrator has likely suffered a period of severe abuse in their life, likely in between the latency and phallic stages of their childhood development. The feelings of helplessness and lack of control forced upon the person just as they enter the very raw beginning of their psychosexual development truly mold the perpetrator's psyche in ways that are 1,000 times more savage and brutal than we can ever imagine. The way they view sex, women, men, control. They're a different breed to us. That person who's felt helpless and lost all their life. When they turn the tables and commit their first crime, it's like they've just taken a drug. A drug that gives them back everything they never had as a child. Strength, power, confidence. They become addicted to that drug. And as you know, once you're an addict, that addiction gets worse and worse, and you have to hit harder drugs to satisfy it. This means the level of sadism and violence inflicted on the perpetrator's victims are of a much more serious nature. The student nodded and smiled at me, acknowledging my in-depth response, and made notes of my answer for her future assignments. I smiled back at her, appreciating her enthusiasm, and turned my attention back to the rest of the students. I noticed one male student was very eager with his hand in the air. I pointed at him and raised my brows. Is that what was wrong with Robert Cassidy? Is it true you interviewed him before he escaped? I heard you and some fed spoke to him in Florence and brought down those, Showtime killers in Wichita? The male student asked, sounding genuinely impressed. Me, on the other hand, I was beginning to feel something entirely different. Rob Cassidy, yeah, he was, well, the thing about Robert Cassidy, I couldn't even say his name. Before I knew it, I wasn't even in the room anymore. At first, it was my head that began to throb, then my heart. My hands began to shake, and sweat was pouring down my neck and back. The egg salad I'd had for my lunch was threatened to fly back up, and I wasn't sure if I could remember how to even draw breath. I began clutching at my chest, as the roar of a blowtorch and intense screams filled my ears. I hit the hard surface of the stage, clawing at the low blue carpet, desperately trying to ground myself. It was no use, though. I was drowning, faintly hearing the concerned yells for help, mixed with some immature sneers and laughter. I could feel the vibration of urgent footsteps rushing up the stairs as I began to fade to black. Quincy smiled, looking at me from his hospital bed, my hand on his leg. I look away, shy. A few seconds later, I look back up. "Why did you help him get out?" Quincy asked, a harsh tone to his voice. His face charred, eyeballs melted, teeth and tendons exposed. Fuck. I shook myself back into the land of the living. I had a glass of water in my hand, empty blister pack of my prescribed Xanax next to it. Sandy, the head of administration, was stood with her hand on my back, smoothly massaging my shoulder blades. Ruth, oh my God. Thought we'd lost you there for a minute. Are you okay now? She asked, concerned. Yeah, sorry, it was just a funny turn. Won't happen again, I assured her. Really? 'Cause that's what you said the first time, Ruth, and the second, and the third. This is the 4th episode you've had since you came back to work. I really don't think you should be here. You need to deal with... I don't need to deal with anything. I just need to get back on with my work and get on with my life. Please, Sandy, just leave me alone. I'm fine, I said, dismissing her concern. Well then, do it. Do your job. Stop blacking out every time someone says his frickin' name, she snapped at me. I didn't blame her. She'd had more than her fill of my denial and my attitude. I didn't want to face it, though. Not yet. I pinched my nose, stayed quiet, and prayed that she'd just leave. She did. And I was just about to truly relax when she turned back to me and added, "Oh, by the way, there's someone at the front desk waiting to see you. I was going to fetch you when I found you on the floor, surrounded by our students. I'll tell them it's a bad time here," she said with an edge to her tone. "Yeah, do that," I replied, sarcastically. "Oh, I'll make sure to tell Supervisory Special Agent Rodriguez that his journey was a wasted one," she added. It took half a second for that name to ring that bell in the back of my mind, but when it did, I sat up in my chair a fraction. "Sandy," I said, catching her attention just before she slammed the door. She looked back at me with raised brows. Thought about the last 2 months of my life and decided it couldn't get any worse, could it? So I looked Sandy in the eye and made up my mind. I sighed heavily in acceptance. Send him in. Chapter 2. Agent Rodriguez looked younger than I imagined he would. The way Quince and Bodkins had spoken about him, I imagined a more seasoned, much more seasoned FBI stalwart, and yet this man was either a rough 40 or an easy 50. But when he told me he was 53, you could have knocked me down with a feather. He chuckled, claiming it was the Latino pigments in his skin that gave him his youthful look, despite already clocking over half a century. "So, what brings you down here, Agent? I'm sure it's not just to show off your coveted caramel skin," I said with a smirk. As the agent observed my plethora of diplomas and certificates on my office wall, a puff of air spat from the agent's nose as my comment caused him some humor. It was short-lived, however, as his matched smirk dropped back into a concerned blank stare. "Noah, you're right. I am here to ask for your help," he said, now turning his attention from my accomplishments to me. "No," I said immediately, swinging my bag to him in my office chair, affirming the negative response. "Oh, come on, Ruth. I need someone with your expertise." "I said frickin' no. I'm done with all that," I shouted, swinging back to face him. My eyes showing my pain, Rodriguez stared deep into them and he began to gently nod. He'd seen the same look in his own eyes every day when he stared into a mirror. "Yeah, I get it, Ruth, I really do. 'Cause I feel it too. The guilt, the burden of it. He was more than a colleague to me. He was my best friend, you know. And whatever role you think you played in what happened, just remember, it was me who authorized his transfer. And even though everyone rightly says, the only person responsible for Robert Cassidy's actions is Robert Cassidy, I still have to live with my decision that day. But honestly, that isn't what haunts me." "What does then? Because the way I see it, he knew if he could just get into a less secure part of the prison, he could escape. And he played me like a fiddle in that interview room. He's out because I convinced Quince to take the deal, and that's why he did what he did." I managed to finish my sentence, struggling to say the actual words. "Miss Bodkins, we work well together. That's all it was, though, professional. But me and Quince, we were becoming more than professional," the agent said with a hint of a smirk. "I know, he told me. Plus, it was painfully obvious in that hospital room, but hey, listen, I understand your pain and regret. You were just doing your job that day, trying to save some more innocent families from the likes of Frank Adams and Jim Mena. Not only that, but doing so successfully, I might add. His pep talk was given with plenty of pride and enthusiasm. However, his expression turned to deep regret as he contemplated his next sentence. But try to imagine if you were stupid enough not to realize when you were being played and actually were the one who gave the animal the address of that safe house that night. His confession was spoken with true shame and embarrassment. I could tell he'd really beaten himself up over it. I understand, too. We tell ourselves if we didn't do this, say that, go there, then it wouldn't have happened, but really, we don't know that, do we? If he didn't get the location from you, he would have just found someone else and tortured them for it. But it's not that easy to let go of guilt, is it? Because it wasn't someone else. It was you, I replied, honestly. He nodded somberly and sighed in agreement with my statement. But that's why I'm here. We can't do anything that'll bring Quince and Bodkins back. CASSIDY is in the wind somewhere over the border. But we can help save some lives. You and me. What do you say? He asked passionately. He eyed me contently as I weighed up his request. Oh, please, Ruth, I need this. I stand a better chance of doing it with your help, he added, trying to seal the deal. I looked into his pleading, vulnerable eyes and wondered how much this decorated agent had tortured himself over the past 10 weeks. He was right. He did need this. And he was being perfectly honest. So did I. Okay, Agent. What is it that you need my help with? I asked, resting my chin on the tips of my index fingers. My eyes let Rodriguez know that I was all in. He smiled at me. Let's go grab a coffee. Chapter 3. I stared down at the 7 Polaroid photos in front of me that had been spread out across the table. I swished my toffee nut latte around in my mouth as I examined each individual photo. 7th victim was just last week. That's his 3rd in the past 8 weeks. All the girls were driving along some remote highway or interstate, had car trouble and pulled over. They were then approached by an individual who then rapes, mutilates, and kills them. He then dumps the bodies in a separate location. Rodriguez commented as I looked at the grisly photos of blood-stained white sheets in the dirt on the side of some highway bankings. What are the bodies like? Is there a common cause of death? I asked, still gazing through the images, looking at the small details in each photograph. Bad. They're really bad, Ruth. This guy, he is messed up. Cause of death ranges a little. Blood loss, circulatory shock, organ failure. Well, it all stems from what he puts the victims through. My guess, he just likes making them scream, till they get to the point where they just stop screaming. Well, must have some way to do this. Bittaker and Norris had a made-up van called the Murder Mac. You can't do what this guy's doing right there on the side of the road. He needs privacy and time, that's obvious. I began to voice my train of thought. What do you know about him? I added. Unsub is a Caucasian male, likely late 20s to early 30s. Potentially drives some sort of pickup or tow truck, making it easy to impersonate a mechanic. Let's see what else. Oh yeah, he has dark hair and brown eyes. Rodriguez listed off the attributes of the offender, taking a good long think to make sure he'd not missed anything. Dark hair and brown eyes? If you had a witness, I asked, surprised. The agent shook his head in sorrow. Oh, I wish. We really need one, but no, the hair and eye color come from DNA. We typed him from semen and saliva, Agent Rodriguez informed me. Likely he's on the younger end of your age scale. He's not had enough time to get a rap sheet. That's why he doesn't care about leaving DNA. Yeah, he knows he's not in the system. If he was closer to 40, then the chances would be much higher that he'd have at least served time for some of his violent or sexual crimes. A person with this sort of compulsive violent behavior wouldn't be able to control it for that long, I assumed, confidently. Here. Rodriguez handed me a case file once he replaced the Polaroids back inside. This is yours to keep for the next 4 days. I have to give a briefing to the local PDs on Friday in Kansas City on who this guy is. I'd really like your input," he said, not let go of the file until I said yes. "Okay, you got it," I confirmed. He released the file and I placed it in my handbag. My now plain, generic black handbag. If I was being honest, it wasn't the only change I'd made to my appearance since meeting Robert Cassidy. I dyed my hair neutral brown. I was practically wearing flats, no makeup in sight, and I'd stopped wearing designer labels. I was as plain as Jane could be. Ever since I left that room in Florence, I was a shell of my former self. "I'll pick you up Friday morning, 6 a.m. We'll fly to KCIA around 10 a.m. Should be at the police HQ for 12. Briefing's at 1. Good with you?" Rodriguez asked, listing the plan for the day. "Sounds good to me, Agent Rodriguez," I said, with a warm smile. He collected his belongings, finished his coffee, and started to slide himself out of the booth. "Oh, one more thing. Call me James," he said, with an easy-going wink. "Sure thing. Well, it's good to finally meet you, James. Quincy spoke really highly of you. It's going to be an honor to work this case with you," I replied, speaking with content. Rodriguez scoffed in modesty. "Funny. I was just about to say the exact same sentence to you," he confessed, honestly, before smiling and leaving the diner. I simply sat in the diner for a few more minutes. I didn't look at the files or the photos. I simply sat there, finishing my beverage, wondering if I could do this. I could barely get through a sexual violence seminar in front of a handful of students without passing out. Could I really help the FBI catch a sadistic serial killer? Lives were at stake. I couldn't mess this up. I couldn't be having episodes in the middle of police briefings or crime scenes. I had to pull myself together. I had to be strong. I had to be Ruth frickin' Maddock. I stood up, left a tip for the waitress, left the diner with my belongings, and went home. It was time to get to work. Chapter 4. I stared in the mirror, applying last-minute finishing touches to my war paint. I put the Christian Dior Rouge lipstick back in my Prada handbag and told myself, "You are Ruth Maddock, and you can do this." 6 a.m. I chuckled to myself. James was here to pick me up on the dot. Quince had told me of his sharp punctuality, and I could now tell he wasn't exaggerating. I took a deep breath and went to the door. When I opened my front door to greet him, the agent had to do a double check. I swear the poor guy thought he'd gone to the wrong house. "Morning, Ruth. You look different," he stuttered, like a nervous schoolboy. "Thanks, I'll take that as a compliment." "You ready to do this?" I asked confidently. He smiled at my newfound swagger and nodded gently. "Oh, you betcha." We were about 35 minutes outside of Kansas City. I was staring out of my window seat at the miles and miles of derelict highways and farmland. I couldn't help wonder if a new victim was lying cold and mangled somewhere, just waiting to be found by some traumatized motorist. James leaned over to me. "Hey, mind if I ask you a question?" he asked softly. Why do I look like I do? I presumed his question. "I could tell you've been dying to bring it up since I opened my front door this morning," I added with a smile. The agent chuckled gently at my perceptive skills. "I can see why you have the reputation you do, Ruth, but no, actually, that wasn't the question I was going to ask you," the agent revealed with a smirk on his face. I raised my eyebrows in curiosity. "I was going to ask you why you looked like you did the other day," he asked. I took a moment to absorb his question and considered what he was asking me. I looked him in the eye. He knew the answer, he just wanted me to open up. "Come on, James, I'm sure you've read the interview transcripts. You heard what he said," I said, trying to shrug off the conversation. I wasn't in the mood for another grilling. I needed my mind firmly on the task at hand. Well, when we found out he was still alive, we went back over previous interviews, trying to find a clue of where he might be. Yours was obviously a key one, being the last interview before his escape. Look, Robert Cassidy has a way of making assumptions about you and using them to asset his power over you. And then he... I cut him off. Well, he didn't assume, though. He was right. Ever since I graduated, I made sure I always wore the highest heels, had the reddest hair, bought the most expensive clothes. It was all a front. You see, during the worst period of my life, I was geeky, shy, and most importantly, oppressed. When I got out of that life, my self-esteem was very damaged and fragile. I wanted to be far, far away from that person, so I completely reinvented myself. You were, reborn, Rodriguez ventured. Yeah, exactly. Ever since, I made sure to be the most intimidating and powerful woman in the room. It helped me forget. But when Cassidy brought it all back up, he took me back to that scared, abused, weak little girl. I remember sitting in that chair, just wanting to tear off the clothes, cut my hair, and burn my bag and shoes. It felt stupid, like I was wearing something I shouldn't. I understand, the agent said, empathetically, before letting me continue. But then, when I held my ground, and it all eventually led to us getting the info that we needed on the Showtime murders, well, I left that room, standing strong again, but then... I hesitated, not knowing if I wanted to say the next bit out loud. It didn't matter, though. Agent Rodriguez knew what I was going to say. But when he escaped and killed Quince, those feelings of strength went away, Rodriguez asked. A strong, powerful woman wouldn't be so stupid to help a sadistic psychopath escape and brutally murder a man she had strong feelings for, would she? After the funeral, I cut my hair, cleaned out my clothes and makeup, and I donated all my designer bags and shoes. Oh, I didn't even realize you were at the funeral, Rodriguez exclaimed. I shook my head. I waited till the service was over. I couldn't face his family and colleagues knowing the part I played, I confessed. Rodriguez didn't say another word about it. I could tell he sympathized with my decision. But, looks like that strong, powerful, intimidating woman's back now, hey, he said encouragingly. There are some other women out there who are vulnerable and at risk to this sicko. The old Ruth Maddock is no use to them. They need this Ruth Maddock. So that's what I'm going to give them. Maybe the only way I can make up for helping one killer escape is, well, by putting another one behind bars. Rodriguez couldn't help but smile. Just as a tone alert went off above our heads and the captain's voice began to ring through the aircraft. Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts as we're about to make our descent into Kansas City International Airport. The time is 12:04 p.m. We'd like to take this time to thank you for flying with Delta Airlines. We hope to see you again soon. Agent Rodriguez plugged in his seatbelt, and his words broke his smile. That's what I like to hear. Chapter 5. Next up on the agenda, old Missing Persons case. We got this back on Cold Case Review a few weeks ago. The MPs are now 25-year-old Haley Stanhild, along with her partner, now 27-year-old Matt Bostock. They supposedly went on a backpacking vacation to Alaska 5 years ago. They weren't reported missing by their families until the 3-month vacation time passed and they still hadn't returned home. Mac picked Haley up from her parents' home in Lawrence at 5 a.m. on the 7th of November, 2013. They stopped to fuel their red 2012 Honda Accord at a fuel station just outside St. Joseph on Highway 29 at around 6:17 a.m. Matt filled the car while Haley went to the restroom. Matt then paid the cashier, and they met back at the car. We're back on the road by 6:35 a.m. That was the last known sighting of these two people. They weren't reported missing until 26th of March 2014, when both Haley's mom and Matt's brother both claims they hadn't heard from either of the pair. Naturally, we couldn't open the initial missing person case until we'd confirmed that they'd simply not just lost their mobile phones in the wilderness or whatever, but after we'd liaised with Alaska State PD and there were no previous or current confirmed sighting of either Matt or Haley in the state of Alaska. Well, not only that, but ASPD have liaised with all the main national parks and trails that the pair talked about visiting. They've regularly searched at monthly intervals for any signs of the couple, but nothing has ever been turned up. No sightings or sign-ins at any of those parks' visitor centers either. We're now assuming that the pair never reached the destination, but we're not yet treating it as foul play. Yet. We're going to send Detective Ryan and Officer Patrick up to the gas station, ask around, try and find out if they changed their destination or plans. Any arguments between the two, or maybe with someone else? Well, see what you can dig up, the police chief instructed. Two men, who I assumed were Detective Ryan and Officer Patrick, rose from their seats, grabbed their coats and straps, and left the room with a roll of their eyes. Clearly a case that was considered to be a dead end among the force, and these two men had drawn the short straw of going over the same evidence and witnesses again, trying to magic up a resolution. Now, finally, come to our number one priority, the Roadside Slayer, or whatever the papers are calling him right now. This man has taken the lives of 7 young girls, 7 innocent, bubbly, youthful girls, brutally raped, sadistically tortured, and savagely murdered in the worst possible way by a despicable, evil human being. 5 of those girls were from the state of Kansas. 2 of them are from Missouri. Because the crimes have crossed state lines, we have the privilege of having the Bureau's input on this case. Agent Rodriguez will be our FBI liaison on this case. We're now going to hear a 30-minute presentation on the killer's psychological profile by renowned criminal psychologist and homicide case consultant, Professor Ruth Maddock of the University of Denver. The floor is yours, Professor. The captain waved me up, and I made my way to the podium. Well, I'll give it to the Kansas City PD officers. They seem to have evolved since I last visited this state. I received applause this time, rather than whispers about the curve of my butt, as well as the wolf whistles and sniggers. I felt confident, ready to deliver my speech. However, just as I was about to begin, clacking my papers against the wood of the podium stand, I heard one of the officers whisper to his colleague, "Hey, she was the one who got Robert Cassidy to spill. That's how Wichita caught Frank Adams and Jim Miller." Well, I froze. It was happening again. My heart began to thump, my palms began to sweat, and my knees began to buckle. All I could hear was the officer's voice in my head say, "She got Cassidy to talk. She helped him escape. She killed Peter Quince. She did. She did it. She's to blame. She's a..." "Oh, she's a fucking hero, bro," the officer replied to his colleague in a hushed tone. That wasn't my imagination or my anxiety. That was real, and all of a sudden, my nerves calmed. My knees straightened and my palms dried. That's why they applauded me. That's why they respected me. I looked into the crowd and looked at Agent Rodriguez. He gave me a nod and a smile, as if to say, "You got this." I smiled back at him because, well, you know what? He was right. I did. On the night of August 24th, 2018, the body of the first victim, Connie Matthews, was dumped outside Huntley Ridge Apartments in Topeka, Kansas. Her body wasn't dumped during the middle of the night, when the streets would have been quiet. No, her body was dumped at 3:56 p.m. in broad daylight. It's only by sheer chance that there happened to be no witnesses to the event. Now, I think it's reasonable to assume this wasn't his plan. Likely he was en route to a dumping ground or lake or wooded area or somewhere he could dispose of the body, when, for whatever reason, he dumps her in this busy area. Why? I opened it up to the floor. Got spooked? one officer piped up. Correct, I said. But by whom? Once again left a pause, inviting someone to answer. One of the officers in the second row suddenly got a look of realization on his face. He shot his hand up like the class swapped. I pointed to him with a smile on my face. Holy shit, the victim. She was still alive. She made a run for it, he exclaimed. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, I said, addressing the whole room. Connie was likely being transported in an open-top truck, potentially under some sort of tarp to conceal her from view. Maybe she passed out from pain or blood loss. The killer mistook that for death, and when she came around, she hopped out and began running. Now, her autopsy report showed she'd had her tongue removed and her jaw was broken in 3 places. Her capacity for screaming would have been gravely hindered. The unsub likely chased her a short distance, hit her with a blunt tool, and before he could get her back in the vehicle, he was spooked into making a getaway. The point is, we don't know what vehicle this guy drives, but if our victim escaped, then it likely isn't a van. We're looking for some old type of 4x4. Maybe worth checking cameras. 4x4 seemingly driving away from that scene in a hurry, or even erratically, I suggested, in a worth-a-try type of manner. The officers made their notes while the police captain seemed impressed. We'll get right on that. Wilson, can you roll those checks, yeah? Sure can, Captain, Wilson confirmed before running off to begin her work. I couldn't help but smile at how enthusiastic this department were to try and catch this guy. I noticed, however, a detective in the front row looking confused and troubled. I tried making eye contact with him. Everything okay? I asked. See, there's something I just don't understand, Professor. If this guy didn't mean to dump Connie in public and he was spooked, then why has he dumped every other victim for us to find? Doesn't make any sense, quite frankly, he asked, a little bit of an edge and condescension to his tone. I could tell from his age and jacket that this guy was at least a 20-year man, who likely had a wife who hadn't worked since she met him, and, most importantly, didn't appreciate it or tarted up classroom desk jockey telling a room of seasoned men how to do their job. I'm really glad you brought that up, Detective. It's a great question. I'm sure one everyone else has on their mind too, and one that I'm happy to field, I answered confidently. Well, this seemed to put him back in his box. The satisfied look on Agent Rodriguez's face caught my eye as I readdressed the entire room. I gave him a look that told him, "You're right, I've got this." I have a theory. I'm not saying focus your thinking on this, I'm just saying don't rule it out as a possibility. We can't afford to have the blinkers on. The room perked up. I took a second to brace myself for the reaction. Cops didn't like psychology, they preferred forensics and evidence. I don't think Connie Matthews was the first victim. I just think she was the first victim to try and escape. I read the room after my opening statement. Right now, I think the crowd was around 30-70 in my favor. Allow me to elaborate. Let's say our unsub kills his first victim, likely someone he knows. He likes the feeling of murder, but believes the murder will land him in jail. While time goes by, nothing comes of it. Starts to feel like he's got away with it. It's a rush. Murder's like a drug. It's an addiction. And sexually motivated homicides are like Class A's to these people. I checked the room again. Probably 50-50 now. He continues to kill again until we get to Connie Matthews. Now we know from the pathologist report that Connie was raped multiple times. She'd had her nipples, eyelids, and nails all torn off with pliers. She'd had various sharp instruments forced inside her reproductive organs. My guess is she passed out from the pain, and our unsub assumed that she'd died from blood loss. He's on the way to dispose of the body, where he's disposed of the others when she comes to. She makes a run, and, as we know, he chases her down, strikes her dead, and leaves her in the street. 80-20 now. I could see where I was heading with this. Same pattern as the first murder. He thinks that this is the one that'll get him caught. He's left a body in broad daylight. His semen, his hair fibers, his saliva all over her. Maybe there was a witness, too. Maybe someone saw him or his vehicle, but no. There's no match on the system, no witnesses, and nothing to go on. Once again, he gets away with it. In his head, this puts him above the law. He's invincible, he's a god. That addiction just got the biggest hit it's ever had. Would you go back to disposing bodies in the dead of night? 100 to 0. I had them all. Even my little heckler spoke up. Absolutely not. You keep throwing bodies in the street. Crackheads don't all of a sudden start smoking caffeine. The whole room began to murmur in agreement and started to frantically take notes. The detective seemed to look around in annoyance at his colleagues with just a hint of embarrassment. He didn't argue with me. The captain stood up. This is truly fascinating stuff, Professor, so where would you suggest we focus our efforts? Do you have any points we can add to our profile? He asked in a highly supportive tone. Yes, as a matter of fact, I've gone through the case files and, using my years of experience dealing with sexual violence cases, I've developed the following points for you to focus on. I began to pull out a number of prompt cards that I'd prepped during my research into the case. Well, we have a person here who, once he has hold of his victim, does things that no person on this earth should ever experience. Violent rape, sadistic violation, and grueling torture, all dragged out for days. This shows a cold, cruel, sociopathic personality that completely gets off on being the one in power and control. These types of people tend to come from abusive childhoods. Feelings of abandonment at critical ages tend to mold these individuals into people who've got an attachment issue and therefore lack empathy towards their human counterparts. I believe our unsub has likely come from a foster home. We only have to look at the actions of serial killers like Roy Norris, Robert Cassidy, and Frank Adams. All these violent killers had feelings of rejection from their families. The man we are looking for is no different. We should consider this sort of background when chasing down leads. The officers took notes while I changed cards. I flicked my eyes up at the room. I noticed that the detective had gone from a look of annoyance to almost on edge. He was looking around the room, watching all his friends taking notes of what I was saying. It was in this moment I realized this was the man of the depot, the one everyone looked up to. He didn't like that someone else had the room. I didn't think too much of it, though. There was someone like that in every department. In addition, it's almost certain that during these sensitive years, our unsub will have suffered abuse, and no doubt he's been made to feel helpless, powerless, and scared. He's suffered physical, psychological, and sexual abuse by people who should have been protecting him. He despised those people. He fantasized about the things he'd do to them, given the chance, and now he's living out those fantasies. I think we need to start asking around all foster homes for boys in the states of Kansas and Missouri. Ask if there are any allegations of abuse made by anyone who fits our description. The notes continued to be taken, along with gentle nods of positive thinking. I couldn't help but admire the focus of these men, every single one of them hanging on my every word. I'd never seen a room so dedicated to finding a killer. Well, apart from that detective, of course. This is all broad strokes, however. You don't need me to tell you that we're dealing with a very damaged individual here. So, let's get a little more specific, shall we? Well, the audience seemed to perk up even more. In cases similar to this one, the perpetrator did what we call dry runs. The toolbox killers, John Wayne Gacy, Edmund Kemper, they all did test runs. They all picked up young girls, hitchhikers, students, and prostitutes. They drove them to secluded locations and timed how long it would take, if it could be done without being seen, and, most importantly, if they could lure people into going with them in the first place. Now, I believe our unsub, prior to his first murder during what psychologists call the contemplation stage, would have fantasized how he'd kill and how he'd get away with it. Now, eventually he moves into the next phase, the preparation stage. This is where these types of killer begin their practical planning, i.e., buying the weapon, stalking the target, purchasing a kidnap vehicle, practicing their routines. This is where the dry runs will be done. We need to engage in an appeal to the public, asking for anyone, if someone who matches our current profile, at any time approach them. Ask them if they needed a lift, wanted to tow into a gas station, or anything. We can focus on the people who claim that they were driven to the direction of that of, Connie Matthews' body site. The police captain stood up. Well, speaking on behalf of everyone here, I just want to say thank you for your hard work and the time you put into this. Is there anything else, Miss Maddock? Well, he's clearly from an area somewhere east of Wichita and west of Sedalia, Missouri. Both his home and his dumping ground are in this area. I believe every victim will be complete strangers to him, except the first. Find his burial site and we'll catch him. I hope some of the points I've risen today help discover that location. In addition, I don't believe he's a family man, nor does he have a full-time job. He's killed too many people in a short space of time to have any sort of normal life to balance with his fantasy life, and, if I'm right, then it's only a matter of time before he kills again. Hey, you heard her. Let's get to work and catch this sicko, one of the officers yelled. I imagined he was the Jack of the Lad of the office, the man they all respected and was the life and soul of the team. And I was right. All the officers jumped up and began to discuss the points I'd raised as they left the meeting room. I smiled in satisfaction and began to pack my things away. Then the police chief approached me. I'd heard a few whispers from my friends in Wichita PD about your help on the Showtime case, but I thought they were just blowing smoke up your ass. I can see now why you have the reputation you do, Miss Maddock. I hope this isn't the last time me and my department get to hear your input on a case. Look, thank you for helping us. This case means a lot to our department, he said, wholeheartedly. Anytime, Chief. I must say it's been one of the best rooms I've ever addressed. Bar your detective over there, of course, I said, gesturing towards the heckler. Your department are really switched on. I definitely plan to help out here again, I said, honestly. He gave me a warm smile and shook my hand firmly. As he stepped off the stage, I noticed the heckling detective was stood behind him. He approached me once he saw I'd noticed him. He held out his hand for me to shake as a mark of respect, and I took it appreciatively. Miss Maddock, I apologize for my comments and tone earlier. I was out of line. I've had a lot of quacks and shrinks come here and try and tell us what's what over the years, but everything you said, it made sense. I think we'll catch him now. I had my doubts before now, but, with your talk about his vehicle and where he lives, I know we'll get him. I'll make sure my guys focus their efforts on finding those points. It's honestly fine, Detective. I completely understand. No, it's not. I was rude, arrogant, and disrespectful. It's just that everybody wants this guy after what he did to Juliet and the others. The bodies keep piling up and everyone's looking to me. I'm stressed, under pressure, and I just lashed out at you. It was uncalled for and unjust. I really hope you can forgive me. I couldn't help but chuckle at his sincerity. I assured him all was well, and he went on his way to join the others. So, you agree that he's from a foster home? You're not going to focus your efforts on that too? I asked, curiously. The detective turned to me. His sincere look turned to one of frustration. I just don't think it matters where this prick came from or who did what to him. It's irrelevant. Look, you guys may be obsessed with the why, but we ain't. We just find the what and the where, and we take little things like evidence and DNA. That's how we catch these pricks. Now, I respect you, Miss Maddock, but you come into my house, you respect our ways, okay? He asked, condescendingly. I didn't dignify his attitude with a verbal response. I simply smirked and nodded my head. And the detective went on his way. I didn't think to ask at the time, but it wasn't lost on me why he was so specific about Juliet Knight, the fourth victim. I couldn't dwell on it too much as Agent Rodriguez took his turn to approach me on stage. "Ready to go, Professor," he said, using air quotes on the word professor, mocking the detective's earlier heckle. I just apologized, actually. Quite humble about it, as a matter of fact, I said with a satisfied smirk as I bent down to grab my bag. Up to a point anyway, I added, disappointingly. And so he should. That was an awesome presentation. You nailed it. Okay, come on, let's go. Grab some dinner, my treat, he said, flicking his head in the direction of the exit. I won't say no to that, I said, accepting his offer graciously. We made our way out of the station, passing through the bullpen of desk workers. I looked upon the pending case board and noticed almost 10 unsolved missing persons cases in just the Kansas City area. Well, I couldn't help but wonder if any of those were the unknown victims of our unsolved. Chapter 6. Myself and Agent Rodriguez found a nice little diner on the edge of the city limits. He ordered a black coffee with a 4-egg omelet, filled with spinach and mushrooms, while I went for my signature toffee nut latte and a chicken salad. We ate in silence, both enjoying our first proper meal of the day. We finished almost simultaneously, before relaxing back against the leather to finish our drinks. Beats the crap they serve on the airlines, doesn't it? Rodriguez quipped, and I chuckled in agreement. Do you think I did okay in there? Truly, I asked, mainly fishing for compliments. Rodriguez took a swig of coffee and responded with, "Oh, you were terrible. I think those were pity applauds, and I think that Sergeant apologized to you just so we could get a better look at your wreck." His sarcastic banter made me laugh out loud for the first time in weeks. I playfully shook my head at his mischievousness. All seriousness, though, that was the best room I've addressed, and I mean universities and police. I honestly can't believe how committed and focused they were. So rare to have the whole room completely switched on, I said, still in awe. I took a swig of my beverage just as Rodriguez finished his. He seemed to hurry the gulp so he could respond. Well, that's because of Officer Knight. Apparently he was extremely well liked. The guy you have in every workplace who's never shy to pick up the tab. Will do anything for anyone. Buy you a beer when you're having issues with the wife. Yeah, he's that guy. Well, he was, he said, shaking his head in a somber manner. I must have gone quiet while I connected the dots and had a really disturbed look on my face. I was just recalling my talk with the sergeant when Agent Rodriguez stepped in. Oh, you didn't know, did you? Surprised given how much research he clearly did. Oh, no, not at the time. But the detective who came to apologize to me specifically mentioned the name Juliet when he was speaking of the victims. Didn't understand why at the time, but it makes total sense now. One of the victims was one of their own kin. No wonder they want this guy's blood. Oh, God, how awful. So, what happened to him then? Did he leave the force? I asked, taking another swig of my coffee. Rodriguez looked disturbed. He's dead, he informed me bluntly. My startled expression was a silent cue for Rodriguez to elaborate on the situation. I don't know whether it was planned, coincidence, fate, or just down horrible luck, but when the body was found and got called in, it was her father who picked up the call. Oh my God, no way! I was horrified. I'd seen the autopsy report. This son of a bitch had put this girl through copious amounts of hell. She could barely have been described as a human by the time she'd been discarded on the side of Highway 70, just outside of Lawrence. Can't imagine how it must have felt when he got out of the car and saw his daughter lying there, mangled and butchered, her vacant, milky eyes staring right through him, his world devastated beyond repair. Yeah, I spoke with some of the desk guys while you were in the bathroom. Apparently one morning, around a week after the murder, he just didn't come into work. Uniforms were sent to his home. They found him laying at the bottom of his stairs, noose around his neck and half of his brains on the corner of the step. I put my hand over my mouth and pinched my cheeks in a moment of deep sympathy. Wife died of cancer about a year back. Juliet was all he had. Poor bastard tried to hang himself, and the anchor point gave way under the weight. Smashed his skull against the stairwell on the way down. Oh, what an awful way to die, I commented, not really knowing what else to say. Oh, we survived the fall, actually. Was rushed to hospital and placed into a coma to try and help him. I thought it was a lost cause, but after a few weeks, there was signs of hope. His vitals were good. Everyone in the local police was praying for his recovery. Doctors did their best and tried to bring him round, but something was clearly wrong with his organs and they couldn't support him fully. He died after a serious cardiac arrest shortly after. Oh, it was a blow to everyone, so yeah, everyone in that station wants justice for the Knight family as well as the other victims. You know how cops are. You go after one of their own. Oh yeah, I do indeed. Well, I guess that explains why the presentation went so well. These people would have simply worshipped anyone who gave them even a sniff of a lead. Honestly, my newly regained front of confidence and swagger did slip for a moment. I felt disheartened and couldn't hide it even if I tried. Agent Rodriguez sensed this and quickly intervened. Oh, Ruth, don't think like that. Because, honestly speaking, you're phenomenal at this. You can really get into the mind of these types of criminals. Those police officers went from being blind and blinkered to being laser-focused and ultra-motivated. It's a rare talent to be able to connect with both psychopaths and non-psychopaths. In my experience, people can only tend to do the one. Rodriguez spoke with such awe, I honestly think I blushed. He saved my front. Well, it's not always a gift. These people, the way they think, it's savage, diabolical, and just plain wrong. You know, it's funny, really. I initially got into this job because I wanted to help people change their behavior patterns before they committed these acts. I'd suffered 5 years with an abusive partner. What if someone had helped him work out his issues and became better? I wouldn't have had to go through everything that I have, but yet it's ended up here, where I'm using my skills to hunt these people down after they've raped and murdered someone. Of every sociopath that I helped put in jail, another 3 seem to be born somewhere else. Sometimes I wish I didn't live in this world. A world where evil will always be a factor in my day. Sometimes I wish I didn't live in this world. A world where evil will always be a factor in my day. Sometimes I wish I simply worked in a flower shop or a diner like here. Somewhere that I wouldn't even be half as aware of the number of awful people that there are in this world. What is it they say? Ignorance is bliss. The agent couldn't help but nod in agreement with my view. I know the feeling, believe me. Ever since the night Robert Cassidy escaped, I haven't been the same, he confessed. I rearranged my seating position, letting him know I was here to listen to him now. After the Swarm trial, my career skyrocketed. Highest profile organized crime arrest in the FBI history, they called it. Shortly after, my mentor died, Bill Johnson. Best agent in the history of the Bureau, hands down. With the people we'd been chasing for years finally gone, and then Bill too, I was lost. I did cases, nothing big. Few bank jobs, couple of drug gangs, but then the bodies started to drop all over the U.S. Flesh-eating, savage sexual violence, brutal murders. Robert Cassidy was the next big thing. When I was assigned to the case, I had purpose again. Chased him for 4 years almost. His sentencing elevated my career to a new height once again. It's funny how when you spoke about this unsub dumping the bodies for a thrill to satisfy his addiction, I can't help but identify with that. After Cassidy's escape, that night was the most I'd felt alive for a long time. The chase, the seeking, the hunt. God, I felt like me again. And then, Quince. The agent took a moment to hold back an outburst of unwanted emotion. I felt for him, and I admired his honesty. You know, they hung a fucking medal around my neck after that night. Gave me a goddamn promotion. All the while that son of a bitch was laughing his way to Canada. My friends were lying in a goddamn bag. Well, that unwanted emotion, it was there now. My lip began to tremble as I completely empathized with his pain over Quince. Do you know what? When I found out he was still alive, a part of me, a very small, sick part of me, well, yeah, I was relieved. Because with him alive, I have something to chase. He spoke his truth and waited for my judgment. Is that why you took this case on? Because you want something to chase? I probed. Full disclosure, I'm actually on kind of administrative leave from the FBI, he said, scoffing at the Bureau's decision. I almost spat my latte out. What? Why? I asked in shock. I was meant to be working with a task force, running a surveillance op on a human trafficking gang in Texas, but let's just say I was a little absent, in both a physical and emotional sense. I was too busy in my house trying to work out where Robert Cassidy could be. The deputy director was concerned with my behavior and even commented on my drinking at one point. Told me to take off a month or two. As far as everyone at the FBI was concerned, I'm taking a well-needed vacation. I'm actually supposed to be seeking professional help, but I think the best thing I can be doing is getting another psychotic monster off the streets. Jesus, James. I can't believe that you only just mentioned this. Right. Just as I was beginning to go off on a tangent at the agent for keeping this from me, a noise cut me off. A cell phone ringing. It was Agent Rodriguez's. He quickly held his index finger up to stop me tearing him a new one in front of the diner, and answered the phone. Supervisory Special Agent James Rodriguez. Whom may I say is speaking? Yeah? Holy shit. How is she? Try to find out what you can before they put her in the ambulance. Hear me? Anything. Name, places, vehicle, anything. We'll meet you at the hospital. Text me her ward and room info as soon as you know. You hear me? Okay. See you soon. Rodriguez was speaking fast and frantic. A man who truly had some huge news. He locked his phone and placed it back in the inside pocket of his Hugo Boss suit jacket. What is it? I asked, eager to be in the know. Another body was dumped just outside of Manhattan. Police were called and, get this, the caller said that the victim was still breathing. They're taking her to AVC now, he said, throwing enough money down to pay for our food and drinks bill, plus a nice 30% tip for the waitress. What the hell are we waiting for? I asked, confidently. James smiled at me and began to burst for the exit. I stopped him in his tracks with my fingertip pressing into his chest. But this conversation isn't over, I warned him. He softly nodded at me, acceptingly. I could tell he was reluctant, however. He pulled out his keys, to which I immediately snatched them from him. He looked at me confused. I'll drive, I instructed. Yes, ma'am, he said, shamefully. He didn't even bother asking why. Chapter 7. I did my best to keep up with a focused Agent Rodriguez in these heels as he stormed his way through the halls of AVC Hospital in the middle of Manhattan, Kansas, desperately looking for our star witness. A flustered receptionist managed to give some startled direction after the agent basically shook it out of her. I won't lie, I was concerned with his behavior and his mental state, now knowing what I did. But this wasn't the time to delve into that. We had a killer to catch, and this was our biggest breakthrough yet. We turned the corner, and as soon as Agent Rodriguez spotted the crowd of doctors in police uniforms, he made a beeline for the room. Has she said anything yet? Is she awake? I want to speak to her, he ranted impatiently. But between one of the officers and the two consulting doctors, they blocked his path and demanded he calm down. I'm sorry, Agent, but I can't let you see her. Bethany is in a very critical stage right now. The next 24 hours are crucial. If she makes it through that, then maybe there's a slim chance she'd be able to speak, but I wouldn't be recommending it, the doctor told Rodriguez firmly, and Rodriguez could not hide his frustration. Listen, pal, I've got a job to do here, so I need to... And so do I, the doctor snapped, cutting Rodriguez's balls off in front of everyone. Now please, Special Agent, a bit of professionalism here while we try to save this innocent girl's life, eh? He added, sarcastically. Rodriguez didn't have any verbal response, but he gave a slight nod and a facial gesture which I think was his version of an apology. I felt ashamed for him, to be honest, and that was before what happened next. A middle-aged couple, who'd clearly been crying a great deal, approached him as he stared at the floor to avoid eye contact with the crowd of law enforcement a few feet away. Hello, Agent. My name's Sandy Matthews, and this is my husband, Jeff, she began. There was a definite edge to her tone, I noticed. Look, Mrs. Matthews, I'm truly sorry about... Rodriguez began to slur before the woman cut him off, mid-sentence with a firm slap to his right cheek. The sharp sound echoed throughout the hallway, causing everyone to look over. The agent's face was blood red, From the embarrassment of the impact itself? Well, I honestly couldn't say. There's no hope for anyone, let alone my baby girl, if you're what the FBI sent to help catch this piece of shit. Grab a breath mint and go sober up, Supervisory Special Agent Rodriguez, she said in a very derogatory tone when she dropped his name. The woman couldn't even contain her emotion anymore and broke down. Her and the girl's father walked over to the window that allowed them a view of their baby girl, mangled, devastated and full of tubes and wires. Agent Rodriguez was left to pick what was left of his pride up off of the floor as I went over to control the situation. Go find us a motel for the next few days. Go get some sleep and I'll clean things up here. We'll talk about what's going on with you when I get back, okay? I asked, but not really asking at the same time. He skulked off down the hallway, muttering under his breath that he would text me the info. I started to think about all the coffee I'd seen the agent drink today alone. No doubt he'd made those coffees very Irish. Well, I couldn't help chuckle. I empathized with him, based on our experiences with Robert CASSIDY. But here this guy is, giving me a pep talk on the plane about my appearance, when all along he's hiding a drinking problem. Up until an hour ago, I wouldn't have known that man had any troubles at all. I started by apologizing to the parents and seeing what they could tell me. Hey, I'm really sorry about my colleague. Trust me when I say today was the worst version of him you could have seen. He's one of the top agents at the FBI, and he's good at catching these kinds of people. I'm sure you've heard of the Swarm. Robert CASSIDY? He helped put all of them in jail. A few months back, CASSIDY murdered his best friend with a blowtorch after he escaped from Florence. He's still coming to terms with that, I explained to them gently. I didn't feel it was relevant to include my own internal suffering caused by that same event. Well, I'm sorry for his loss, but that's my baby girl in there. Look at her. Go on, look, she demanded. Her husband, who hadn't said a word during this whole exchange, moved to his right in order to give me a view of the inside of the room. I looked inside. Doctors say she has around a 15% chance of survival. And even if she does, she'll never be able to have children. She'll never even go to the fucking bathroom again. Skin grafts to her breasts, face, and back. Glass eye, brain damage. What sort of life does that sound like to you, Mrs. Maddock? I answered somberly. And no, it doesn't. I'm truly sorry for your daughter, Mrs. Matthews. And I can assure you that myself, the police, and Agent Rodriguez will catch this man, I added, making a stern promise to her. Just leave us alone, she demanded softly. I think she wanted to thank me for my assurance, but understandably just didn't have it in her. I headed over to the 3 police officers who were sipping their coffee a few feet away, no doubt waiting to see if the girl lived and talked, or someone showed up to finish the job before she did. Okay, guys, can we forego all the awkward questions about my colleague's state of mind and get down to business? Who was first on the scene? I asked sternly. 2 of the officers turned and faced a young-looking officer who looked, quite frankly, like he'd seen a ghost. It was, I was, ma'am, the young officer managed to mumble out. Oh, the poor kid. I instantly felt a surge of sympathy for him. He'd clearly been traumatized. Hello, officer. Stevenson. Yeah, sorry, ma'am. Yeah, it's Stevenson. He could barely string a sentence together. His nerves were shot to pieces. I gave him a warm smile at his failed attempt at courtesy. Hi, Officer Stevenson. I'm the criminal psychologist consultant on the case. My name's Professor Maddock, but please call me Ruth. Is there somewhere more private we can have a chat? I asked in the gentlest tone I could muster. Yeah, cafeteria, lower floor, he informed me. Sounds perfect, I confirmed, smiling still. We made our way to the elevator and left the other 2 officers outside the victim's room as the cries and wails of the girl's parents suddenly rang out through the hallway. It wasn't good news. Chapter 8. I arrived at my government-paid motel in Agent Johnson's car around 7 p.m. that evening. He'd been good enough to swap my room next door to his. The desk clerk informed me that my colleague had my room key and just to give him a knock when I got here. I smiled and thanked him for passing on the message. I headed over to room 9 of the Gables Motel and knocked on the door. I heard the TV background noise as I waited for the agent to open the door. I found myself fixing my hair as I waited for the sound of the chain being removed from the slider. A sense of shame and guilt washed over me. Thankfully, I didn't have much time to dwell on it, as James opened the door. He looked like he'd been suffering from the same feelings, if I was being honest. Come in, please. His invite was a soft plead. I nodded and followed him in. The TV was showing a middle of a breaking news report. A female victim, whose identity is reported to be that of Bethany Matthews, a 23-year-old waitress from Manhattan, has sadly passed away from her injuries tonight at the Ascension Via Christian Hospital. While nothing is certain at this point, it's strongly believed that Ms. Matthews is now the 8th known victim of the serial killer known to the public as the Roadside Ripper. A violent and dangerous individual who has terrorized the highways of Kansas and Missouri for the past 6 months, abducting young women, subjecting them to grueling acts of torture and mutilation before dumping their bodies on the roadside without a care in the world. Ms. Matthews is so far the only victim who has been found alive. It is unknown if she was able to identify her attacker before she died, but CNN News will follow this story deep into the night. I'm Donald Stevenson, reporting live from outside AVC Hospital. Agent Rodriguez pressed the button on the remote and shut the TV off. As he sat on the edge of his bed, his head fell into his hands in defeat. Our star witness gone. I acted like a total asshole in front of her parents when she was alive, and now they have to grieve for her. Oh, good God. His voice trailed off into a whisper as he struggled to comprehend how bad this day had gotten for all those involved. I took a seat next to him, allowed my bag to slide from my shoulder to the floor, and I waited for him to turn and look at me. How long's the drinking been going on? I asked, straight to the point, but with a hint of empathy. When do you think? He asked, rhetorically. You know when you came into my office and spoke about this case, and how it helped that guilt I was feeling, that ultimately wasn't mine to bear, and you were basically a therapist in an FBI uniform? He nodded, shamefully. Well, that was all transference, wasn't it? You were trying to convince yourself of that stuff, weren't you? You think if you catch this guy, you'll stop those voices in your head that tell you that you killed Quince, don't you? I demanded to know. Tears began to pierce the lens of his eyes and stream down his face. He looked utterly and completely vulnerable. I see him, Every fucking night I see his face, burned. I can smell it, the torched flesh. I hear him screaming and begging for mercy. I'm haunted. That's the only word to describe it. I know the drinking's wrong, but it silences the voices. I polish between half and a bottle of bourbon off every night. Then I sneak into my office throughout the day. Can't go on like this, though. Maybe if I help get this guy, then I'll be back to normal again. He confessed softly. Oh, James. I sighed softly, filled with sympathy. I came to you because you're brilliant at what you do, and I honestly didn't think I could do it on my own. He spoke with a raw honesty that a lot of people could have mistaken as self-pity. But I was looking into his eyes, and they told me he believed what he was telling me. You could have killed me, both of us. We've driven over 200 miles today, with you behind the wheel, tanked up on Irish coffee. This can't continue. If we're going to keep working together to catch this cycle, then you need to quit the booze. If you're hearing voices or whatever you want to call them, then talk to me, okay? Deal? I laid the ultimatum at Rodriguez's feet and waited his reaction. His delay to respond and the torn look on his face, like I was asking him to choose between his 2 children or something, told me that this wasn't casual drinking. This was turning into an addiction for him. Okay, he answered, heavy-hearted. I didn't judge. It's hard to face your feelings. James. I addressed him by first name to show I was being serious yet empathetic. I can tell you've already begun to gain a tolerance, and with no alcohol in your system, I understand that may affect you physically. So, I'll help to wean you off of it. I'll drive us where we need to go. I'll make sure you have enough liquor to keep you even. I worked as an addiction counselor as part of my work experience in my sophomore year. I know what I'm doing. I once again waited for his reaction. He didn't say a word. He just broke down into my embrace for a few short moments. He soon pulled himself together and sat back up straight. Thank you, Ruth. You really are an incredible person. His tone, so genuine I couldn't help smile. And so are you, James. You're just battling some demons right now. We both are. You helped me fight mine, so I'm going to return the favor. I promised him, sincerely, and he nodded in approval. There was a silence as we shared a moment of mutual positivity. I do have a little bit of good news, I enlightened James, causing his demeanor to perk up. The girl, she managed to tell us something before the ambulance arrived, I added. Oh my God. Well, what did she say? James asked with excitement. Well, it's not what she said. Her skull was fractured, her tongue had been removed, and her brain had a lot of swelling. Actually, she wrote something in her own blood in the dirt just before the ambulance arrived. What did she write? Rodriguez asked. I took a moment before I was ready to answer. I wasn't sure what to make of it myself, if I was honest. Pig, I answered eventually. Pig? P-I-G? Pig? Rodriguez asked, constantly checking he'd heard correct. I could tell he thought the same as me. Well, you don't think... Wouldn't be the first time that a serial killer in Kansas turned out to be wearing a badge. Who told you this? Young'un, Stevenson. He was really pale and withdrawn when I asked him about the girl. I honestly thought it was due to seeing the horrible sight, but no, he told me in the canteen that the girl was reported anonymously. He gets the call from dispatch and turns up to find this girl on the side of the road. Oh, total mess. Mangled, twitching, and gargling blood. He assumes she's trying to ask for help. He assures her the ambulance is coming and everything's going to be okay, you know. Cop shit. This girl, with her last ounce of strength, takes a stub from where one of her fingers was amputated and writes in the dirt. He said she lost consciousness almost just after she finished the G. Jeez. James didn't have any other words. I mean, maybe we're jumping to conclusions here, I speculated. Maybe. Let's just not rule anything out. Who else knows? He asked. Just you, me, and Stevenson. He said he didn't know what to do. He only told me because he knows I'm not even in law enforcement. He said he took a picture on his phone and covered the blood with more dirt, I said, bringing him up to speed. Good, well, at least we can say Stevenson isn't a suspect. Makes no sense he'd tell us that if it were him. But I don't know. This, along with the fact one of the victims was a cop's daughter. I really don't know, Ruth. This is disturbing. I'm not gonna lie. James said, running a hand through his hair, as if trying to come to terms with the gravity of this new incident. Get Stevenson to send you a copy of the photo. I want to see it, he requested. I gave him a nod, confirming his request. I think it's best we both get some rest. We both start tomorrow with a clear head and a rested mind. We take into account what we know now, and look at this again. Sound good? And by both of us, I meant mainly him. And by clear head, I meant not boozed up. He got that, though, I could tell. I'll be around at 8 a.m. We'll make a start on everything. I laid out the plan while James nodded away. I got up, grabbed my bag, and made a move for the door. Oh, here, let me get that for you, James insisted, rushing to take the chain off the latch. I turned to him with my palm out. The bottle, I demanded. He conceded and pulled a 1-liter bottle of scotch from his suitcase and placed it in my hand. And the other one, I demanded, harder. He bit his lip, skulked back to the suitcase, and pulled out a half-empty bottle of bourbon. He walked over and handed it to me. I placed both bottles in my handbag. Then I turned back to him. And the rest, James. Final straw now, and this time James began to really sulk. I've given you everything, that's it, he said, a frustrated anger in his voice. Fine. I'll go book my flight back to Denver. Should be able to get a red-eye, I said, walking away from him. Wait, he snapped. He rolled his eyes, dropped his gaze to the floor, and shook his head in defeat. A few short seconds passed before he sighed heavily and stormed over to his bedside table. He pulled the drawer open and grabbed 4 small bottles of assorted spirits. He placed them in my hand like a spoilt child who'd had their Game Boy confiscated. Very good. Got there in the end, didn't we? I teased. Aren't you going to accuse me of holding out again? He stropped. No, I know there's no more, I said confidently. Wait, what? How? The first 2 times you gave him up way too easy. I told you, James, I've worked with addicts long enough to know the reaction of someone who's just handed over their last drop, I informed him, with a gloating grin on my face. He shook his head and frowned at my cockiness, but he couldn't help but hold back a grin either. Good night, Ruth. See you in the morning. Good night, I replied, as I started to walk to my room. Just before I heard his door close, I turned and yelled back to him to get his attention. James? He stopped and reopened the door, raising his eyebrows to show me he'd heard. I'm proud of you. Chapter 9. There's an awfully long gap between knocking on Agent Rodriguez's door and him actually answering it. But when he did, I saw why. Morning, James murmured with a weak voice. He was pale, shaking, and the sweat was beating down his forehead. Jesus, James, I exclaimed as he essentially collapsed onto me. Oh, God, come on, let's get you inside. I dragged James's half-dead form across the room and threw him onto the bed. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry that you had to see this. James could barely apologize due to the tremors. I quickly began pulling the bourbon out of my bag and placing an empty glass on the table. Don't apologize. There's a liquor store right down the street. You could have gone, but you didn't. This right here shows me that. Now, let's get you even, I said, as I began to pour around 35 centiliters of neat alcohol into one of the motel's generic glasses. Here, come on, drink up. 1 now, then half this measurement in the evening. No more, no less. We'll try to reduce each drink by 5 centiliters per day. You could be detoxed within the week. Look, I won't sugarcoat it. It's going to take some will, James. But I know you can do it. I passed him the glass, which he grabbed with 2 hands and began to pour the medicine down his neck like it was the cure for cancer. Good, okay. Well, I'm going to head out and get us some breakfast. Just let that take its effect and we'll go to work. I waited for his response, but I didn't get one. He just continued to lay in a ball on the bed, desperately trying to stop the shakes. I left him to heal and exited the room. I made my way back to the room, with 4 croissants, 2 flat whites, and 1 criminal psychologist raring to go. I put the key in and unlocked the door. As I entered, I kicked off my heels and let my bag slip from my shoulder onto the table, along with breakfast. I looked up and was gobsmacked. Pictures, profiles, maps, locations, post-its, crime scene and pathologist reports, all plastered on the main wall of the motel room. Every victim, where they were last seen, where the bodies were found, how they died, any leads, any witnesses. I was astounded. The bathroom door swung open and there he stood. Not vulnerable and withdrawing James, but Special Agent Rodriguez. He was even, he wasn't slurring, he wasn't shouting. He was back and he was ready to fight his demons. Wow, I'm honestly impressed. I've only been gone an hour. Well, I thought it was the least I could do, given what you've done for me, he explained. I'm just helping out a friend, I informed him, but I could hint a bit of awkwardness after I said the F word. So then, what do we have so far? I asked, quickly changing the subject. I approached the board, examining all the information that Rodriguez had put together. The picture that Officer Stevenson forwarded of the word pig was pinned next to the information on Bethany Matthews. It wasn't lost on me either that newspaper clippings of the Showtime killers, a.k.a. Frank Adams, a freelance crime scene photographer, and Jim Mellor, a Wichita PD cop, were both pinned next to Juliet Knight's profile. There was also a huge piece of green tape joining the two cases. It was clear that Rodriguez was looking at the police very closely. We spent the next few hours going through every case individually, piecing all the details and evidence together with a fresh set of thinking. Rodriguez might as well have had a drip of coffee inserted into his vein, given the amount he was going through. I imagine he was starting to dry up and once again feel the withdrawal symptoms. Fair play to him, though. He just got on with it. So, our unsub stalks the highways. You might even say patrols, I ventured. Like a cop, James stated. All the victims were drivers and their cars were all found abandoned. Why else would they get out of their cars? Were they forced? I speculated. Maybe they were pulled over, James added. Shit, I sighed. This was getting hard to rule out law enforcement. I know. Only thing that puzzles me, though, is, well, if it was a police officer, a job where you're strongly trained in first aid, CPR, stuff like that, why leave the victim alive? Surely you'd know they could ID you. Huge risk, he wondered. Well, regardless if this is a police officer or not, ultimately he's a serial killer first, and my analysis remains the same. He's addicted to murdering these girls. First he buried them, then he dumped their corpses. Now he needs a new rush. Maybe this was him getting a bigger rush. Leaving Bethany Matthews with a hint of life in her injected a new element of risk, I explained. And if I was honest, I wasn't totally convinced we were dealing with a cop at this moment. Couldn't rule it out, though. For now, IB team regular serial killer, whereas James had clearly made his mind up. I guess, he muttered. Okay, let's say it is a cop. Are you saying it's a lone wolf or a bad apple like Frank Adams or Jim Mellor, using their status to aid their crimes? Or are you thinking something more sinister? I probed. James took a pause and ran his hand through his hair, which was now becoming a common sign for him being overwhelmed with his inner demons. He walked over to the armchair in the corner of the room and flopped into its embrace. He grabbed his coffee cup and prayed there was something left. I don't know, I honestly don't. But I just know one thing for certain. Each day thousands of people put on a badge and swear to protect and serve the public. And there's an alarming number of them who intend to do the exact opposite. They protect and serve the highest bidder, he admitted shamefully. And you think that's what's going on here? A conspiracy? James took a minute to get his proverbial ducks in a row. When I worked under Agent Johnson, we got given these cold cases, some runaway types. One was recently released from juvie, a semi-homeless girl and also a sex worker. Types of girls who no one would miss, and no one did either. As he started with the beginnings of what would no doubt be a riveting trip down memory lane, I decided to make myself comfy opposite him on the corner of the bed. I also grabbed what was left of my coffee. I allowed him to continue. Now, you see, Bill was very opinionated. I liked that about him, though, to be honest. Not everyone else did. Anyway, office politics and the fact Bill refused to be any part of a clique ended up with him being given the shit. Dead-end jobs. And then, by association, me too. I shook my head to show my contempt for such behavior, but also not interrupting him. So, we're on these cases. 3 missing persons initially, but their bodies were found, eventually. Every one of them had been raped, butchered, and dumped. They'd all been branded, too. This weird symbol, scorched right into their skin, just above the ass. No one gave a shit at first, but then this girl gets snatched right from outside her frickin' house in broad daylight. People think it's some sort of ransom deal, because this kid is the daughter of some big hedge fund owner. Then this little girl's body turns up too in the Chattahoochee. Same condition, same mark. Well, you can imagine people really started to give a shit now. Suddenly this case that was a punishment has just become the biggest case in the last 5 years at the Bureau. We were getting strong pressure from the DD to find some sex pervert to pin it on and make us look good, but Bill, he wasn't convinced it was a killer. He thought it was something more, something sinister, and, well, he was right. By now I was hanging off his every word. That symbol was a butterfly. Rodriguez said with intensity. The swarm, I exclaimed. Yep, from that investigation you have no idea the shit we uncovered. Oh shit, I'm not even supposed to tell you. But I will because I need to tell someone. I only ever told one other person, and he's dead now. Jeez, James. What? I asked, my adrenaline through the roof. Well, it was no secret that the 10 high-ranking members of the Swarm's command network were made up of powerful people. Senators, terrorists, CEOs, political figures, gang leaders, and satanic cult leaders. But what was withheld from the public were 2 things. 1, over 150 police officers across 5 states, from uniformed rookies all the way to a few police chiefs, all in bed with these guys, helping cover up murders, track down witnesses, and silence anyone who threatened to expose their bosses. Good God. I could barely believe my ears. What's the second? There weren't 10 shot callers. There were 11. The 11th figure was codenamed the Queen. I highly believe that she was the founding member, the one pulling the strings. She could have anyone in any organization, criminal or non-criminal, on this earth, snuffed out and never to be seen again, with nothing but a thumbs down. Oh, we were desperate to find her. If we could uncover the Queen, then the rest of the swarm would fall. And did you find her? I asked, eager to know. Him. We found him, yes. Took an undercover operation which took around 3 years and ultimately cost the life of the UCA, but yep, we did it. It was Henry Gibson. His words blew me apart. No fucking way. The director of the FBI was the leader of the swarm? Ex-director of the FBI, but yeah, unbelievable, isn't it? The president and the attorney general both ruled that to protect public faith and also to protect a potential asset. So, Henry Gibson gave up the rest of the command network, and in return we faked his death for him. Even his family have no idea what he did. To them and the rest of the world, he died in a plane crash somewhere over Cuba. Or actually, he's in a secret facility off the coast of Costa Rica. It's a government supermax facility, a black site, so officially it doesn't exist. But he's definitely there under a new name. Gets to go out once a week to fish and swim. Lives better than most people in there anyway. He's set to be released in 2029 under a new alias and will be set up somewhere far from the USA. Couldn't barely wrap my head around the huge piece of knowledge I'd just received. This was honestly like finding out what happened to the Dyatlov Pass, or if Area 51 is a fucking real alien base. Well, I just muttered a few words that evidenced my shock, such as shit and holy fuck. So you see, it might seem likely to you that cops did these girls, but I've learned to keep a very open mind. I bet, I answered facetiously, not really knowing what else to say. Oh, and Ruth. I know it goes without saying, but I'll take that to my grave, James, I assured him. I hope you do, because I think anyone who threatens to reveal that secret will be expendable, he warned me. My facial expression assured him I knew the risks. He seemed satisfied that he could trust me. Okay. Agent Rodriguez broke the silence. What's our next move? Chapter 10. Over the next few days, I continued to help James get his alcohol abuse in check. We started to revisit each and every person who we questioned in regards to every murder. We thought that if there was a police officer involved, then the investigation may have been deliberately misled. Going through the evidence, we noticed that the details in the police reports regarding the murders of Juliet Knight, Maggie Dana, and Jessica Price were all quite brief in terms of detail compared to the other 5 victims. Knight, Dana, and Price were the only victims who were discovered in Missouri. We decided to talk to the detective leading the investigation, a Detective Hansen. We called the KC police chief and requested a meeting with the detective in regards to those murders. An appointment was arranged for the next day. We planned to talk to the families of Dana and Price. We couldn't talk to the Knight family, they were all dead. So bright and early, we got our stuff together and headed towards the KCPD depot. On our route to Lexington and Columbus, I turned to Agent Rodriguez, who looked a little on edge. "Everything okay?" I probed. He was resting his temples against his fingers and thumb, massaging them gently. My question caused him to stop and face me. "Oh, yeah," he half answered. "You sure?" I asked facetiously. "Yeah, I'm just feeling a bit dragged out. I don't know if it's the withdrawal or whatever, but the nightmares are started again." "Quince?" "Yeah," he answered, lifting his head up momentarily to show he was listening. "I'm honestly so proud of you. Keep this up and you should have detoxed in a day or two." I smiled at him encouragingly, and he half smiled back. We walked into Kansas City PD and requested to see the officer in charge of the Knight, Dana, and Price murders, which, coincidentally, was the same person who'd heckled me at the briefing, Detective Mark Hansen. The desk sergeant told us to take a seat while he fetched Hansen. We sat down in the waiting room, and something caught my eye. A jar half filled with coins and dollar bills on the front desk. It had a note on the front that I couldn't quite see from my vantage point, so I stood up and made my way around to take a look. The note read, "For the family of Officer Stevenson." My eyes widened and my throat clenched when I realized the significance of the name. I had no time to react before James came up behind me. "He's here, Ruth. Come on," he informed me gently over my shoulder. "James?" I prompted him with my eyes toward the jar and the notes. "What?" James asked, taking his gaze from me to the jar. I saw him as he read the notes. His gaze went from curiosity to concern. We shared a look, just as a voice yelled at us from across the room. "Can I help you guys or what?" Detective Hansen yelled, impatiently. James ushered us over to the detective, and we went into his office. Hansen sat down behind his desk in a chair that I thought looked a little too expensive for a state detective, but I let it go. "Miss Maddock, nice to see you again." There was an almost sarcastic tone to his greeting. "So, what can I help you guys with?" Hansen asked. Elbows rested on the arms of his chair, his fingers interlocked, a crabby expression plastered on his face. Clearly a busy man who didn't think much of us suited-up federal servants. James, who had either shaken off his crippling withdrawals or he was hiding them extremely well, leant forward in a confident manner. "We were just hoping you could tell us why the case reports on the murders of Juliet Knight, Maggie Darna, and Jessica Price don't have as much detail as the rest of the Roadside Slayings. 3 of the 8 murder victims in all these cases were assigned to you. Can you explain this to me? It's just I've gone through some of your other homicide casework in the past, and it's quite frankly excellent. No stone unturned. Plethora of information, you might say." Hansen scoffed and gave James an intimidating glare. "The case files had everything in them that needed to be. Causes of death, where the bodies were found, possible suspects, and so on." Well, you see, that's where I beg to differ. The reports on the other 5 victims, there were other suspects on the list. Abusive ex-boyfriends, Facebook stalkers, disgruntled clients, but, well, in these 3 reports, the only suspect is the elusive unsub, the roadside ripper. Did you not think it was worth investigating any other avenues? James quizzed further. Hansen chuckled at the implication he was either incompetent or corrupt. He leant forward to match James's demeanor, showing he wouldn't be intimidated. Those 3 murders, bar Bethany Matthews, were the most recent victims. By this point, we know this killer's M.O. Why waste time investigating other avenues when it's obviously the killer was expanding his territory? Coroner confirmed the methods of torture and death were the same as the other roadside victims. Violently tortured, reproductive organs mutilated, and then either died from blood loss or strangulation. Textbook M.O. of our resident serial killer. Now, if that's all, I have a killer to catch. Hansen stood upright in a huff, inviting us to leave by showing us the direction of the door. We both nodded and accepted the invite. "So are we, Detective. We want to catch whoever's doing this. You just wanted all the information possible to make that happen. I understand why you have tunnel vision on this, but Well, it may be worth speaking to some of the victims' families. They could perhaps shed some light on if they knew who matches our profile. Well, the last killer I investigated, I caught when he made the mistake of killing someone that he knew, I explained diplomatically. Hansen hung his head and nodded gently. Adams and Mallard. There'll forever be stains on the badge. I understand now why feds are suspicious of cops, especially from around these parts. But believe me, Miss Maddock, we're not the enemy, Hansen stated, genuinely. I gave him a smile. I know. We're sorry for making you feel threatened, James added. Oh, I'm sorry for being defensive. It's been tough recently. We recently had a vet commit suicide because one of the victims was his daughter. Then 2 days ago, a rookie went the same way after Bethany Matthews basically died in his arms. Everyone's a little distracted, Hansen confessed. Stevenson didn't look shaken by the Matthew murder, but I wouldn't have flagged him as a suicide risk. Well, I'm sorry to hear. Well, in that case, you focus on the Matthews case. We'll go chat to some of the families from the Price and Knight cases. We'll let you know if we find anything, I said, trying to sound supportive. Hansen stared at us for a few seconds, presumably trying to weigh up if we were being helpful or patronizing. Tell you what, wait here. Help yourself to tea, coffee. I'll go get a list of known associates of those victims. Numbers, addresses. Call it a peace offering, he offered, holding his palms out and shrugging his shoulders. Oh, thank you, Detective. That sounds great. James accepted. Hansen left the room, and me and James took him up on his offer of a hot beverage. What do you think? I asked, wanting James's opinion on Hansen. Well, hard to tell. No cop likes having their work ethic or morals brought into question, but if this killer is a cop, it's highly likely someone with a marked car, like a patrol officer. Someone who can pull people over or approach them without concerning them. Detective doesn't make sense. That if it's even a cop. A pig could have meant anything. Why not write cop? James let his train of thought run away with him for a little while. Well, I guess we'll see what we find out from our inquiries with the And the office door swung open, cutting me off mid-sentence. So here's a list of the victims' home addresses, relatives, known romantic connections. Hope this helps. Hey, keep me in the loop, yeah? Hansen said, handing the paper to James. James shook his hand and smiled in appreciation. I mimicked the gesture and assured him we'd be in touch. We left the station and climbed into our car and set off to the first address. We headed over to the Kansas City state border into Missouri and made our way up to Lexington. It took us just under an hour to reach the family home of Maggie Darner. The area had quite a vibe to it. Nothing much happened in this quiet town, but the dumping of Maggie Darner's heavily mutilated body on the side of Highway 24 was clearly the worst thing to ever happen around these parts. We pulled the car up outside the grey wooden townhouse, climbed out, making sure we had our IDs handy. We walked up the garden path, which had a slight incline to the front porch. James tapped politely but firmly on the screen door and awaited an answer. We were just about to leave when a man, who'd probably just passed the status of middle-aged, answered the door. "Can I help you?" he asked tentatively, clearly weighing up if we were here for him. "Oh, I'm sorry to disturb you, Mr. Darner. My name's Professor Ruth Maddock, and this is Special Agent Rodriguez. We're just here following up some inquiries into your, The man scowled and held his hand up, cutting me off mid-sentence. I was getting sick of that happening, in all honesty. I think there's been some sort of clerical error. Darners haven't lived here for nearly a year now, and we bought this place from them, as they were moving to Grandview, if I remember correctly. Something about father, new job, I can't remember the specific details. Terrible news about their daughter. Terrible, the man said, arms folded, shaking his head as he stared at the floor panels of his white porch. James and I shared a confused look. James then turned to the man. Yeah, sorry, our records department can sometimes forget to delete these old addresses, and then this happens. Can't get the staff, can you? James joked. So, you don't know the forwarding address, then? Oh, we did, but we got rid of the paperwork during the last spring clean. Anyway, after their daughter turned up just outside the town on 24, we assumed they moved back, the man speculated. We didn't know how to answer the man's theory. We were totally in the dark, so we simply nodded in agreement. Well, thanks for your time, Mr. Evans. Tony Evans. Well, Mr. Evans, please take my card. If you happen to come across anything regarding the Darner family or their current whereabouts, James requested, handing the man his card. The man examined it and put it in his pocket. Well, holy cow. Not every day you get to meet a famous FBI agent, the man exclaimed, and James grimaced. Ah, it is you, isn't it? We saw you on that Netflix documentary that came out a couple of years ago. We loved it. Inside the Hive. Hey, is it true that the undercover officer had his cover blown and he had his nuts cracked with a claw hammer? Oh, was that just for dramatized entertainment? The man asked, genuinely intrigued. I stared at James, a little taken aback. It's, true. Clayton was a good agent, instrumental in gathering the evidence we needed. Did not deserve what happened, James said, sheepishly. The man made a religious gesture by tapping the 4 points of the cross on his body and head. Definitely not. Oh, don't forget the kid who saw that murder and had to go into protection. Hey, is it true you and your partner were moving him across the country until the trial? Because these guys sent someone after him to shut him up. The man fired another question, like an excited fan. Yeah, that's right, James answered bluntly. Why not just put him in a safe house under FBI protection? Why keep moving him? That's what me and my wife wanted to know. A little unorthodox, no? The man probed. Well, the question made James uncomfortable. I could sense it, and I butted in. Oh, sorry, Mr. Evans. We have other places to be. Thanks for your time, I said politely. James nodded. It's actually quite common practice these days. Worked, didn't it? We got him to trial. Oh, thanks for your time, Mr. Evans, James said, as he walked off the porch. Goodbye, the man yelled. Wait till Bernie hears about this. We heard the man celebrate to himself as he re-entered the house. We climbed in the car and set off towards the address we had for the Price home. As we were driving, I turned to James. Netflix, huh? I asked him with a smirk, which James returned. Yeah, they were becoming loads of internet detectives on Reddit, looking into the swarm and their command network, digging up info, trying to find out who the real top boss was. Because we were hiding Henry Giverson's involvement, we needed a way to get in front of it. A Netflix documentary was made. The FBI were sort of a secret producer. We included the undercover operation, some of the witnesses, the 10 commanding entities in the swarm. Did you know that online theories into the Stephen Ivory murder case actually reduced by 73% after Making a Murderer was released? People see a comprehensive 10-part series on a case, and they think they've been given the truth. That's the effect we wanted, James informed me. Makes sense. Okay, one more thing. Go on. Why did you lie to the guy and say it's normal to move witnesses continuously? Because as far as I'm aware, it isn't. I was genuinely intrigued, and it obviously wasn't in the documentary, even if I did have time to Netflix and chill, as the kids say these days. Our UCA relayed information at the command cell. It was the information that blew his cover, but with it, we had more than enough to convict. It was a laptop with an encrypted dongle and chat room that the top 10 in the swarm used to contact Gibson. He managed to get his hands on it and get it to us. Our IT guys took a week to decipher everything, but once we did, well, we had them. Just before Clayton was made, he relayed info that the swarm had someone in the federal government. This kid had witnessed the murder of an FBI asset, a surveillance operative, and a little girl hostage. Him and his friend went to the local police. They killed his friend. They were dirty, too. The swarm's reach was clearly wide and vast. We managed to get to him before the swarm's hitmen did. We kept him and his family safe and moving. Until we knew if we had the snake in our ranks, we couldn't risk putting him in a federal safe house. And we were right to. Gibson all along. Well, at least it's over now, I said, optimistically. James nodded, but didn't say a word. We arrived in Holden, again in just under an hour. Very similar town to Lexington, quiet and rural. Price's body was dumped around 20 minutes away, just outside Columbus on Highway 50. Again, brutally raped, tortured, and eventually, mercifully killed. Another silent neighborhood where a tumbleweed wouldn't have looked out of place. We approached the door. The garden looked unkempt, paint peeling, and the panel door was barely hanging on. James even knocked on the side of the house, afraid he'd finished the door off. No answer. He tried again, this time louder, but nothing. Eventually I tried one more time, as loud as I could while screaming, "Mr. and Mrs. Price, this is the FBI. It's about your daughter." Well, James gave me a confused look, questioning if that was necessary. I didn't want another wasted journey. However, it was looking like that was the way it was going, except just as we were retreating to the car, a voice began yelling at us from down the street. Hey, wait! Don't leave!" The young teen began yelling as she hurried towards us, pushing a pram in tow. This girl was no older than 20. She'd have been Jessica's age, or thereabouts. Can we help you?" I asked. "You heard about Jessica, right?" she asked, the baby cooing in its bed from all the commotion. She shushed him back to sleep as I confirmed who we were. "You found that little cunt who did it yet?" she demanded to know. A little taken back by her language and directness, James needed a second to think of what he needed to say. Sorry, who are you?" he asked. "Mary White, Jessica's best friend. You found the bastard that cut my girl, then." Her southern twang was powerful. Inquiries are still ongoing," James said, officially. "That means fucking no, then, don't it?" the girl said, rolling her eyes. "I made hundreds of phone calls to your tip line telling about her new boyfriend, but no one ever wanted to know," she added. Me and James, our eyes widened in unison. We both turned to the girl. "Sorry, what boyfriend?" James asked. She said he was from the city. I never trusted him. He was nice looking and everything, but he just had something about him that I didn't trust," the girl confided. "Was this guy at the funeral?" James inquired. "Hell no, he weren't." "Now, what'd that tell you, huh?" she asked, hands on hips. "Oh, that is odd," I confessed. "What did this guy look like?" James asked. 6 foot, mid to late 20s, black, slick back hair. Looked like he had a bit of something else in him. Hispanic, maybe. I don't know. Nice skin, deep brown eyes, good teeth. Like I said, real good looking." The girl described literally the opposite of Detective Hansen. "Okay, we'll look into it. Here, take this. Call me if you ever see this guy again, but don't approach him, not until we can verify who he is." "Did she say if this guy had a name?" James asked, finishing his notes and handing the girl another card. "Pablo. Didn't say if he had a last name. Guy had money, though. Always picked her up in a flash car. Asked me if I wanted to come with, but I had to watch this one," she explained, gesturing towards her baby. "You know where Mr. Price is, or Mrs. Price?" I asked, gesturing towards the house we just visited. "Mrs. Price, yeah. Shortly after Jess was born, she got the cancer," she informed us. "And Mr. Price?" James asked. "He's dead, too." "What? How?" I probed. "He was always into the needle, but he got clean around a year ago. This business must have set him off, because cops found him OD'd in his bed, needle in his arm. Enough heroin to kill a horse, apparently." "Oh, jeez," I exclaimed. "Yeah, he did go a little crazy, though. He was always complaining that the police weren't doing their job and not following up leads on Pablo. Guess the stress just got to him in the end," Mary speculated. "Well, thank you. You've been really helpful," James concluded. Mary slipped the card in her bra, and she retreated with her baby. We climbed back in the car and set off back towards Kansas. Chapter 11. Why wasn't any of this in the file? The Downers move away. That could be an admin issue, easily explained. But the fact that Jessica Price's father and her friend made multiple inquiries about a mysterious boyfriend and there's nothing in here about it, oh, that's weird. Then, not to mention nothing about the father's death. Something doesn't make sense here, I exclaimed, and James murmured in agreement. But, well, Pablo is young, rich, mixed race, and good-looking. Hanson's middle-aged, dressed, and whiter than rice. I'm starting to think maybe this Pablo could be our guy, and he's benefiting from police tunnel vision, James speculated. I didn't answer, and stared off into the countryside. You don't agree? James quizzed. Just doesn't fit our profile, I stated. I don't know. I bet there's not many young damsels in distress who wouldn't get into a flash car with a handsome stranger these days. Do you? James probed. No, I guess not, I conceded. Besides, his appearance fits the DNA profile. And you said he'd be young, James added. A brief silence passed before I suddenly piped up with something on my mind. I just think it can't be coincidental that the two victims we've inquired about today have a connection to Kansas City. Like, why did the killer dump Maggie Donna outside our old town when she just moved to the city? Our guy lives and hunts in the country, not the city. Something just isn't adding up. We're missing something, James. I know it. I assured myself as much as I did James. James began to nod gently. Well, let's get some answers, he said, pulling out his cell phone and dialing a number. He held the phone to his ear, and he kept his eyes on the road. Hi, can you put me through to Detective Hanson? Tell him it's Agent Rodriguez, he said in a stern voice. A few brief moments passed before someone picked up the phone again. Oh, hi, Detective. Listen, we chased up those leads you gave us, but they were dead ends, although we were told by a neighbor that the Donna family had moved to Kansas City. Could you make some calls and find an address for me? We really think it'll be worth speaking to them. A few more moments passed while James listened to the response from Hanson. He just simply nodded along to whatever he was saying. Don't worry about it. Thank you. I appreciate that. Look forward to it. All right, I'll be in touch tomorrow when we've spoken to them. Yep, you too, he said, hanging up the call and then putting the phone back on its charging dock. So, what did he say? I asked. He apologized for wasting our time. Says he's been too busy to chase up the family. He'll find a current address and text it to me later tonight, James informed me. You didn't mention Mary White or Pablo. You're not convinced about him, are you? I asked with a smirk. Well, ask me that again after tomorrow. We arrived back at our motel a few hours later. It was dark by then. Me and James were walking to our rooms when the text came in. Hanson sent us an address just outside Ottawa, Kansas, a little town called Homewood. We'd head there tomorrow. As we reached our rooms, we lingered outside for a moment to review the day, so to speak. James eyed me intensely. Ruth, do you believe in fate? He asked thoughtfully. I smirked at his sudden toe dip into philosophy. Like a higher power, moving all the pieces around, moving towards a common end? No. I've seen too much violence and chaos in this world to know that there's no such thing. We're all put here, and we just do the best we can with what's given, I answered, honestly. James seemed to be struggling with something. He could barely look me in the eye. It looked like he had something to say or ask, but was buying time with pointless questions. Well, I didn't either, but I think things put your way, and then well, you need to look out for it. I've been struggling with this for a few days, but after seeing how quickly things could be snatched away from us, I've decided to believe in fate. James left his words to hang in my ears before he did the unthinkable. He kissed me. My eyes widened. I was shaken. For a split second, I swore I could see Quince over James's shoulder, looking disappointed. I pushed James back. What are you doing? I demanded to know. James could barely look at me. Oh, God, I'm so sorry. I've just thought since the minute I met you that you're one of the most incredible, beautiful people I've ever met. You helped me sober up and became myself again. Well, I just thought... Well, you thought wrong. God, you know how much I miss Quincy, and you've tried to take advantage, I snapped. No, Ruth, that's not true. James was lost. We're colleagues, helping to solve a violent string of rapes and murders. Nothing more, nothing less. I think we should call it a night. We have a long day tomorrow, I instructed harshly. I then stormed away and into my room and left James to lick his wounds. When I woke up the next morning, I found myself in a moment of self-exploration as I made myself presentable for the day ahead. Well, I did like James. He was a strong, intelligent, kind, and integral man. He was easy to look at, too. I think I reacted the way I did because I felt guilty that it was only a few months back I had feelings for James's friend. And had he not been murdered by the psycho that I helped escape from prison, well, we'd potentially have a future. I was extremely harsh on James. I decided to go speak to him. I left my room and made my way down to the local coffee shop. I grabbed James's favorite latte and a croissant to go with it, a peace offering. I retrieved it at the motel and knocked on his door, optimistic about where this talk could go. Well, I was smiling to myself, but that didn't last long. James wasn't answering the door. I began to get worried, so I went to the front desk and requested a spare key. Well, they were happy to oblige, given that they'd seen us together. I went back to the room and inserted the key. I opened the door, and my heart sank at what I found. I drove towards Homewood, expecting to be there within an hour. Traffic depending, of course. I was upset, disappointed, and most of all, furious, with James, but also myself. I found James face down on the bed, almost comatose, with 5 large empty bottles of whiskey, bourbon, and vodka scattered around his room. I tied it up, placed him in the recovery position so that he didn't choke in case he vomited again, and I left a note, telling him that when he wakes up, to please resist the temptation to repeat his antics, and that I would speak to him later. I hated him for relapsing because I knew he was better and stronger than that. But I also hated myself because, well, I knew on some level I was to blame. I was around 35 minutes into my journey when Mike came across something that made my brow lower. In the road there was a car, parked diagonally across both lanes. The hood of the car was facing in the direction that I was traveling, and the hood was popped. It's hard to tell until I pulled up around 50 yards from the stationary vehicle that someone was under the hood attempting to fix the issue. I climbed out and began walking over to the car. I squinted my eyes through the gap between the car's hood and the windscreen, as well as where the hood was propped up. The man was wearing all black from what I could tell. There was something off, though. Like, why was the car across the 2 lanes? I could understand if the vehicle had been in a collision, but it looked pristine. Hey, is everything okay? Do you need me to call someone? I yelled out to the man. Nothing. I began to feel extremely wary about the situation I was in. And then my suspicions were confirmed when I heard something behind me. An engine. I turned tentatively and saw that a dark transit van with blacked-out windows was flying towards me. It broke sharply around 75 yards from my car and skidded into a stationary state, with the side doors of the van facing me. I was frozen. I watched in terror as the van door slid open, and out jumped 4 large men. They were all wearing dark combat gear and bomber jackets. Their faces were covered by black balaclavas, and they were rushing towards me. The most alarming thing about them were the weapons they were carrying. 2 had pistols with silencers, 1 had a baseball bat, and the other was carrying a mallet. I instinctually turned and began to run towards the man with the broken-down car, completely forgetting how weird he was in his own right. That's when I saw the man had now come out from behind the hood of the vehicle, and he was walking towards me. He was also wearing a balaclava, and he was carrying a claw hammer. My eyes widened, and not even my La Prairie skin caviar could hide how pale I went in that moment. My adrenaline surged into my veins, and my fight-or-flight response began to toy with which way to go. As the man who was under the hood got close, my body finally made up its mind, and I fled back to the car, stumbling and tripping as I tried to sprint in my heels. I managed to get to the car before the men reached me. I got to the door and flung it open, I fumbled in my pockets, desperately trying to find the keys. My only lifeline. When my pockets turned up nothing but a half pack of gum and a lipstick pen, my heart dropped. I turned to the group of masked assailants, insidiously cantering towards me. I turned to the left and saw the lone man standing still. Through his mask I could see he was smiling, almost chuckling. His gaze fell to the floor and he got down on one knee. He rose from the ground seconds later, holding in his hand the keys to James's car. I was frozen again. The only movement from myself was my head snapping from left to right, watching as the men continued to close in from both sides. When suddenly, I was hit with an intense sense of clarity. This was a federal agent's car. I quickly lunged under the seats and began to tap my hands around, searching for a weapon. James was on administrative leave and had to surrender his FBI-issued pistol, but I would bet my life, essentially I was, that he still carried an emergency gun. And I was right. There, taped to the bottom of the passenger side seat, was a Glock. I ripped it from its adhesive holster and quickly pulled out the magazine. I wasn't sure how many bullets were in. I didn't have time to find out, but it felt heavy. There were enough to take some of these fuckers with me, and at the very least, I only needed one bullet to not give them the satisfaction of putting me through something horrible. The man who had the keys to the vehicle was just outside the window. He ripped open the door and lunged inside the car and grabbed me by the hair and started to drag me out of the car. I pulled so hard I was out of the vehicle in 3 forceful tugs on my blood-red coats. My back and head hit the tarmac so hard that as he stood over me with the hammer, he was merely a black blur and nothing more. He raised the hammer above his head and was just about to bring it down on me when I raised my arm and pulled the trigger. His brains exploded and the contents of his skull membrane sprayed all over my face, clothes, and the side of James's car. I dragged myself to my feet, still in a haze from my ordeal thus far. Then, without warning, the passenger side window exploded outwards, glass slicing my face as it came into contact with my skin. I considered myself lucky, however, as it was a bullet that had caused it, probably that had missed me by no more than a couple of inches. I dropped down to the floor, taking cover from more bullets that burst the other window and begun to rain into the metal chassis of the car. I crawled and pushed my back up against the back tire to provide more cover, and that's when I saw it. Underneath the rim of the tire, stuck to the underside of the car, was a magnetic GPS tracker. I looked down at the last piece of the puzzle. I'd wondered how these men had found me. Hansen had put this on our car, no doubt, when he was putting those addresses together for us. When we'd confronted him and requested that he give us an updated address for the Dartmouths. Clearly he knew we were getting too close to the truth. He gave us an address in the middle of nowhere, and the tracker allowed these men to see when we were getting close.
"Where's the other one? They said there'd be a man too. We need both,"
one of the men said to the others, indicating they were just on the other side of the car.
Don't bitch. Take her alive. Use her to lure him out here. Easy save," one of the men replied. "Pablo said we can do what we want with her if we take her breathing, and I want some time with that," one of the men whispered menacingly.
"Hey, you get in line," another snapped back under his breath. I needed to act fast.
"Oh, miss, come out and put the gun down. There's nowhere to go now. No one's coming to help you,"
the first man instructed. I assumed he was the leader of this pack. I took a deep breath and prayed. I rolled around and fell on my side. I aimed the pistol under the car at one of the men's feet. I pulled the trigger and watched the flesh and bone of his ankle burst into a puff of red mist and smoke. He screamed in agony and fell onto his back. I aimed once again, and this time I put one right in his neck. The others began to fan out, not wanting their feet to be blown off too. I quickly reached through the open car door, the blood of the first man still dripping on the back of my neck as I reached in. I grabbed my bag that had my phone inside. I fired a couple of shots at the men, causing them to duck behind what cover they could find,
and I fled towards the car that originally blocked the road. James's car was useless now. It was shot to shit and the tires on the other side were full of bullets. But I was hoping the first man had left the keys in the ignition, perhaps wanting a quick getaway from the scene after I was dragged into the van by the others. I left my heels this time. Running barefoot, the red-hot tarmac scorching the soles of my feet was the least of my problems. I managed to reach the vehicle just as an errant bullet struck the corner of the propped hood, no more than a centimetre from the back of my head. I jumped into cover and opened the passenger side door. I looked inside, and the shred of hope that I had left my body. The men were now hiding behind James's car, taking cover. I could see the top of their ski masks from my vantage point. One of them poked his head out to survey the situation. I took aim at him and pulled the trigger. The gun clicked. I pulled the trigger again, and it clicked once more. The man must have been able to sense my horror by the look on my face, as I looked at the empty gun in pure dismay. I heard the man begin to snigger at my now obvious predicament. He informed the others it was safe to come out. And the men stood up. They were all smiling now, and they were heading this way. I quickly pulled out my phone and checked if I had a signal. No such luck. And the men were getting ever closer. I held the phone in the air, desperately trying to find some sort of signal off the car's antenna. Just when the men were around 25 yards away from me, I got one bar. I quickly pulled up James and pressed call. It went straight to voicemail. I didn't have time to redial 911, so just before the men grabbed me, I rambled out what I could. James, I'm on Old Highway 50. I know who killed those girls. They're here, and they're about to take me. Before I could relay anything about Hanson, one of the men ran around the car and knocked me to the ground. He stamped on the phone hard. I watched as the pieces of plastic shards and electric components exploded across the road. And I knew in that moment I was dead. My body gave an almost involuntary response of letting out a loud, piercing scream before I shot to my knees and began running. I was quickly caught by two of the men. "Oh, baby, where do you think you're going? The only place you're going is to take us to your partner. It's a long drive, so I think we can have some fun on the way." One of them snarled at me and let out a cackle. They began to drag me, kicking and screaming towards the van, whilst the other man ran ahead and jumped into the driver's side door. They opened the van door and violently threw me inside. One of the men reached inside and grabbed a jerry can. He handed it off to the other man and instructed him to torch the leftovers. The hulkish thug nodded his head and jogged over to James's car. With almost minimal effort, he threw the bodies of his fallen associates into the back seat of James's vehicle and doused it in gasoline. He postured up, attempting to strike a match from his pocket. As he did this, the driver made a call. We've got her. You can take down the roadblock now. We need to find the Fed. Now, we'll meet you at the... His sentence was cut short by the sound of a rifle firing. We all turned to see where it had come from. We were greeted by the sight of the man with the jerry can, stood there, matches still in hand. Except his head was smashed like a watermelon. He hung for a few seconds before crumbling into a heap. This allowed us to see that there was a man resting a rifle on the back end of the decoy vehicle. A few seconds passed, and another gunshot sound pierced the quiet country air. A hole blew in the side of the man guarding me, and he bent over in pain. I didn't need another invite. I kicked the man in the back, knocking him to the ground in a prone position. I climbed out of the van and ran to the rifleman, who was frantically waving me over. The driver obviously didn't want to join the Bullet Club. He fired up the engine and tore off back the way it had come from originally. When I reached the man, he quickly ushered me down the road, where we climbed into his red pickup truck and sped so fast out of the area that the tires spun in the dirt, causing a large dust cloud. I stared out of the back window, praying that when the dust settled, I wouldn't see that van chasing us. Instead, though, all I could see was the man who'd been guarding me, stood in the middle of the road, just
watching us as we drove away. I stared at him, wide-eyed, as the man simply reached down to his belt, pulled his pistol from his waist, put it to his temple, and pulled the trigger. Chapter 12. "Geez, miss, you done got yourself in a spot of trouble here. What's that all about?" he asked in an eager tone. Well, the man was definitely a real country dweller. His speech was that of someone who didn't interact with people much. I wasn't judging, though. This man had just saved my life. I say man, he couldn't have been any older than 22. "I'm, helping the FBI solve those highway murders. You heard of the Roadside Slayer?" I stuttered, still overdosed on adrenaline. No, ma'am. I don't watch the news all that much," he said, sounding a little embarrassed. But again, I didn't judge. Clearly spent his time on the firing range rather than binging TV shows, and for that I was forever thankful. "Those men are responsible. They have to be," I stuttered to myself. "Yeah, I knew something wrong was up, 'cause I saw the road was closed for fixing, and darn, government never do any work out here. Seemed fishy to me, so decided to check it out. Good job I did, huh?" He sounded proud. I simply nodded, frantically in agreement. I could barely string a sentence together. "I need to call my partner. Do you have a phone?" I managed to ask, desperately trying to calm my nerves. The man shook his head again, and he looked down in shame. "No, ma'am, I'm real sorry. I don't have one of those cellular phones." His speech was impaired, seemingly suffering from some sort of learning difficulty. "Well, I don't live far, though. Just on my uncle's farm. They have a phone there. You could call someone. But he's out right now. He won't mind, I'm sure of it," he said assuringly. I nodded in return and smiled warmly. "Thank you," I gasped, emotionally, as I began to tear up. He smiled back. "Well, name's Tuck." "Ruth," I replied. He nodded, acknowledging we were now on first-name terms. He turned back to the road, sped up the truck, and made his way to the farm. We arrived at the farm around 15 minutes later. A quiet, desolate structure. I wasn't sure what the boy's uncle farmed, but it didn't look to be very fruitful. Well, as long as it had a phone, I didn't care. The farm was off the grid at the bottom of a 300-yard dirt path that was hidden by overgrown trees and shrubs. If you didn't know it was there, you would never find it. The very physical definition of off the grid. We pulled up outside the barn and the boy jumped out. He opened up the barn door before getting back in the truck and driving it inside. He instructed me to jump out and exit the barn, which he closed behind him. "Well, I got to take care of a couple of things, but you're welcome to head on in and use the telephone," he offered. I nodded my head once again. "Thank you, I will. Where is it?" I asked, more fluently this time. My nerves were almost settled now. "Oh, yeah, it's just down the hall, opposite the third door on the left. Once you go in the front door, you'll see it," he informed me. I smiled once again and thanked him for everything he'd done for me today. "Don't mention it, ma'am. And relax, those bad men can't hurt you now," Tuck assured me. He made his way around the back of the barn whilst I headed to the front door of the ranch house, which was just adjacent to the barn. I walked up the porch steps and pulled back the screen door protector. The springs needed a good oil job and the noise went right through me. I pushed through into the house and made my way down the hall as directed. The landline phone sat on a table opposite the third door on the left, just as he said. I found myself jogging over to it eagerly. I didn't know James's number off by heart, so I simply dialed 911. The phone rang twice before the operator picked up. "Hello? Do you require police, fire, or ambulance?" Police, please," I replied. "One moment," the operator said. A brief pause followed before the call was connected. "Yeah, hello? Kansas State..." The call cut off. I tapped the receiver a few times, but it was useless. There was no dial tone. It was then I heard someone approaching the house.
The fear was back. Shit, they'd found us. I frantically started to look around for somewhere to hide. I quickly scanned the house, not having time to run, as I could now see a masked figure in dark clothing. I could see through the stained glass in the front door that he was approaching the house. I grabbed the first doorknob I could find, turned and flung it open. I dived inside and closed it behind me without seeing what I was entering. I crouched down and tried to stay quiet. It was pitch black, so I assumed it was a closet or a broom cupboard of some fashion. I stayed quiet, hearing the man enter the house, the springs being a dead giveaway. I was trying to control my breathing, but the horrible smell coming from behind me was revolting. I turned quietly and put my hands out and felt around, and I discovered that I wasn't in a closet. I was in a basement. Without warning, the door was ripped open. I snapped my head around and looked up at the man. What I saw was the most insidious thing I'd ever seen in my entire career as a criminal psychologist. Stood there was the boy, Tuck. I recognized his black fleece jacket that he was wearing earlier, along with his ripped jeans and boots. But there was one change to his appearance. He was wearing the head of a pig. I don't know if it was my body screaming that I couldn't take any more adrenaline, or I just couldn't comprehend the horror in front of me. But I went lightheaded and fell backwards. I tumbled down a single flight of wooden stairs until I struck the cold concrete at the bottom. Tuck began to slowly and methodically walk down the steps. Whilst I rolled around, groaning in my blunt agony, I saw what was causing the smell. In the middle of the basement sat a chair, a simple metal chair that was covered in bits of flesh, some fresh, some rotting, and the chair and the floor surrounding it was soaked in blood, wet and dried. Next to the chair there was another simple metal desk. On it lay tools, pliers, bolt cutters, hacksaws, files, clamps, knives, hammers. There was also a collection of vile sex paraphernalia. These were also caked in red and brown. In the corner was a mattress. I don't need to repeat myself again in telling you what it was covered in, amongst other stains too. I began to cry as Tuck reached the bottom of the stairs. It was useless getting a weapon from the desk. That would almost certainly seal my death. The biggest cause of women's stabbings in home invasions is them grabbing a knife from the kitchen. Men are significantly bigger and stronger than the average woman. Short-range weapons are usually easily disarmed from the woman and end up being used on them instead. And the best thing to do is run or hide. The only problem was I could do neither. Tuck pulled back his fist and snapped it forward. It went black so fast, I didn't even feel it. Chapter 13. I awoke some time later. It only took me a few seconds to realize the consummate danger I was in. I was nude, and I was duct-taped to the chair. I could feel the pieces of flesh from the poor women who'd sat in the chair previously, pressing into my back, my thighs and glutes. My wrists and ankles fastening in place, with my mouth heavily wrapped too. Tuck was standing in front of me. The pig mask was on the desk, next to the tools. He was bending his knees, coming to eye level with me. He still had bits of blood and flesh on his forehead and cheeks from where he'd had the pig's head on. Up until this point, I assumed it was a very good mask. Turns out, it was an actual pig's head that he'd hollowed out. I winced at how utterly fucked up that was. I looked into his dead brown eyes. I'd noticed he had black hair earlier, but I was too focused on the ambush. I didn't even register his eyes. If I had, I don't think it would have clicked at the time. His eyes dropped from my face to my breasts, and he kept going. He began to groan to himself. "Oh, my, Miss American Pie. To think I was just heading to dump the last bitch when I came across you and your pals." His voice was more fluent, still country, but the earlier voice had been an act.
He could sense I'd picked up on it. Takes a lot for people, especially women, to trust strangers these days. On any normal day, a woman like you wouldn't dream of getting into a truck with a guy like me. Not with all the evil in the world these days. When I saw those men trying to get you in that van, there was no way I was letting them have all the fun. I mean, whoo-wee, look at you. But after those guys jumped you, and I saved your fine ass, I figured you'd be wary of anyone, so I acted like an idiot. I guess you'd think a dumbwit like me couldn't possibly be another one of them trying to fool you. And it worked. Here we are, he exclaimed gleefully. So, what are you going to do to me? I asked. My eyes flicked towards the desk. I couldn't help it. So did Tux, and he grinned sinisterly. Whatever the fuck I want, you filthy bitch, he growled. He walked over to the desk and picked up a knife and skipped back over to me. Let's start nice and gentle. Bit of foreplay, huh? His eyes were wide and his pupils pinned. This is what evil looked like. I was staring at pure depravity. He placed the blade on my chest and dragged it slowly down towards my stomach. The blade sliced into the top few layers of my flesh, and I let out a shriek of pain. Tuck began to giggle as he became erect. He started to rub himself, psyching himself up. Oh, let's just get to the fun stuff, he declared impatiently. He walked over to the desk. His fresh, warm blood began to run down my torso from the 10-inch slit in my upper chest. Tuck picked up a large metal file and walked over to me slowly. No prizes for guessing where I'm going to shove this, he said. His eyes never relaxed. He never blinked. He was just wild inside and calm on the outs. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the blinding agony to come. He grabbed my shoulder with his left hand and reached back with the file in his right, aiming the point at its intended target. I tried to zone out. I wasn't sure how to do that, but it was all I could do to try. Suddenly I heard a sound that I recognized, and a sound that Tuck did too. Springs. Rusty, unoiled, noisy springs. Followed by the sound of steady footsteps as the floorboards above us creaked. Oh, what the fuck? Tuck snapped. There were clearly multiple people upstairs trying to make as little noise as possible. The men from the highway, they must have followed us here. You killed one of their men. My heart was pounding so hard in my ears I could barely hear the words I'd just spoke. Tuck began to lick the inside of his mouth, now retreating to the desk and switching the file for the largest knife on there. A machete from what I could tell. I killed one of them. I'll kill these fuckers too. Ain't nobody gonna take this from me, he said, and scuttled across the room to a small flight of stairs that led up to a hatch that presumably opened to the side of the house on the outside. He never took his eyes off the small puffs of dust falling from the ceiling as the footsteps approached the door in the hallway. Gonna get the drop on the city boys. Then I'll be fucking back to pick up where we left off, he said coldly. I sat there, not knowing who I wanted to win. Neither fate would be pleasant. With any luck, they'd all kill each other, and I'd die of dehydration. Much better. Tuck quietly opened up the hatch door, and he sneaked out. I heard his boots on the dry, sandy dirt as he jogged around the side of the ranch. I also heard the man upstairs trying the doorknob, and I began to whimper. Closing my eyes tight, I desperately tried to leave my own body. Stop right there. Kansas State Police. Put your weapon down or we'll be forced to shoot you, an authoritative voice yelled. I looked up, hopefully, when suddenly light flooded the inside stairwell. 3 KSPD officers stormed down the stairs, weapons drawn. Holy shit, she's down here. Get a medic, one of them yelled. I looked at the men and just cried. I didn't know what else to do. Then, storming down the stairs, past the officers, was James. He looked at me, his face one of pure distress. Oh my, Ruth, he yelled. He ran back up the stairs as quickly as possible, screaming for the medic to hurry up and to bring a blanket. He had enough respect for me to clear out the male officers and allow the female paramedics to attend to me. As he was leaving the cellar, he said, "You're safe now, Ruth. I'll be outside waiting for you." I didn't answer him. I just continued to sob. Around an hour later, the medic brought me out. She cleaned my wound, which was completely superficial by all accounts. But she demanded I go to hospital to check for any infections, test for HIV and hepatitis, and, most importantly, monitor my head injury. I had a rough day, and she didn't get any arguments from me. James was by the ambulance, pacing on hot coals, waiting for me to appear. When I did, his face lit up. He was elated by the sight of me walking and also the fact I was smiling at him. "Your friend is fine to ride in the ambulance," she said with a cheeky smile. We had a deep conversation about James and my feelings towards him while she stitched me up, mainly to take my mind off the pain. James thanked her and he helped me inside. I laid back on the stretcher while another EMT monitored my blood pressure and vitals. James held my hand and looked down at me. He was holding back tears, I could tell. "Well, you look like shit," I joked, attempting to lighten the mood. James chuckled. "One day at a time, just like you said," he replied, and I smiled. "Ruth, I'm so sorry. I let you down. I should have been there. I should have..." But I cut him off. "If you were there, we'd both be dead. The only reason Tuck saved me is because he wanted me to himself. Hansen set us up. He's..." James cut me off now. "I know. We found the car and the tracker. The fact Maggie Donner's parents live nowhere near Homewood and the tracker of the car, well, it was enough to convince the police chief that Hansen was dirty. They searched his office while he was out on a case. They found a burner phone in a secret compartment in his desk drawer. It wasn't linked to anything, but it was enough to get a warrant to search his personal vehicle and his home. There they found money in his attic, over 12 burners, one of which made a call to a phone we found on one of the bodies that were in my car. They also found the GPS tracker on one of those men, too. He's in custody now at the station. So is Tuck. Real name, Thomas Danmore," James informed me. "So what's the relation between Tuck and Hansen, then?" I asked, confused. "There isn't one that we know of. My guess is Hansen's in bed with some bad people and he fixed it so their crimes look like another roadside slaying. I guess we'll know more when KCPD speak with them," he presumed. "No, we should talk to them. I want to be there. Look both them bastards in the eye," I said defiantly, my blood pressure spiking. The EMT asked me to calm down. I complied. "I'll see what I can do. But you have to promise me you'll stay in hospital until the docs say you're fine to leave." "Deal." James smiled. He turned and looked out of the window. "James, one more thing." He looked down at me. "Yeah." I grabbed his collar and pulled his face towards mine. We shared a kiss. I felt the warmth of his lips on mine, the rough of his stubble against my contrasting soft skin, the chemistry bubbling over in our mouths. We parted. His eyes remained closed for a few seconds, wondering where on earth that had come from. He opened them and eyed me curiously. "Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to kiss you the other night, but I guess I was angry that I wanted to. I still felt guilty about Quince. I took that out on you. If I hadn't, then you wouldn't have relapsed," I said, genuinely. James shook his head. "You don't know that. You can't blame yourself. I should have been stronger. Besides, like you said, it all worked out for the best. We'd be likely rolled up in a rug somewhere if we were both there," James speculated. I took a moment to think. "Last night you asked me if I believed in fate. I said no, but after today, I'm a believer. The chances of how today panned out, well, I'd like to see the bookmaker's odds on that." "Yeah, I know. It's not even the craziest part. When I woke up, I read your note and charged my phone. First thing I saw was your voicemail. As soon as I heard that, I called a friend and got them to trace the call. They saw the call pinged off a cell tower around 2 miles from where we found the ambush site. As I was waiting for the police to pick me up, I got another call. This was from an officer who was in that briefing you gave. They'd found a number of traffic cams where they saw a red 4x4 pickup leaving the scene of the Connie Matthews site.
They tracked it traveling down Dwight E. Eisenhower Highway, where the sighting stopped after the E600 turnoff. That's the road that heads down to Clinton Lake. Divers have been searching that lake for the past few days. This morning they found 3 bodies. 2 of them are male and a female, who've been missing for nearly 5 years. The other body they found was a highly decayed Jane Doe, but early DNA testing indicates the girl was between 19 and 21 when she died. She had a lot of injuries consistent with multiple acts of blunt force trauma, wrapped up in a tarp with a hammer. The DNA on the hammer matched the DNA of the Jane. However, that body was far too old to fit Danmore's timeline. But upon forensic examination of the other 2 bodies, those findings were heavily significant. They were Haley Stanheld, along with her partner, Matt Bostock.
James paused. Holy shit. The 2 who were going to Alaska, right?
Correct. Haley and Matt have been killed with a rifle, much like the one you said Danmore killed those men with. Both were in the trunk of their Honda Accord at the bottom of the lake. He went to great lengths to keep them hidden, James informed me.
And how old is Danmore? I queried.
He's 18. You were right. Too young to have developed a record, James revealed with a smirk.
But that would mean he was between 13 and 14 when he committed a double murder, I surmised with a disturbed and confused tone to my voice.
James simply shrugged.
Yeah, it's fucked up, but not implausible.
He knew her after all. He knew her car. Obviously they were closely acquainted in some respects. He could have found out her schedule, snuck out of the home, and followed her and her partner. After all, it was only a short drive from Clinton Lake to the home. Maybe he snuck into the back seat while they were out on a quiet road. In terms of the murder, he would have needed strength or power to kill the 2 adults, hence he used a rifle. Ballistics reports show the bodies were in the trunk when they were shot, so I bet Danmore forced them in at gunpoint to make disposing of them much easier. All he had to do was shoot them, close the trunk, and push the car into the lake. And as for his age, Robert Cassidy killed his first victim at the age of 12. If these people are pushed earlier, then, they snap earlier. Just the way it is, unfortunately, James stated with somber.
Do you think Haley was the one who abused him? That's why he killed her?
I asked. Yeah, it makes sense, wouldn't it? Took a lot of premeditation and planning to execute the murder. Obviously needed a lot of hate for the motivation. I guess we'll find out when he talks. I nodded along at James's comments.
So, who do I have to thank for me being alive? I asked.
Officer Sarah Wilson. She found you fascinating. Took notes of all your briefing, especially where you said the unsub would have been adopted or abandoned, with a history of abuse. She said she started to look into Lawrence Home for Boys. She was practically threatened by Detective Hansen to stop wasting time and resources looking into dead ends. Then, upon the discovery of the bodies in Clinton Lake, she said Hansen took over the case almost immediately and forced her out. She knew something was up, so she kept digging. She found out that Haley worked, before her disappearance, at the Lawrence Home for Boys. During her inquiries into the establishment, she was told off the record by a couple of staff members that it had had numerous reports of sexual exploitation, but there'd never been any official investigation launched. Anyway, they checked the list of boys for someone matching our unsub's DNA profile description, and wouldn't you know, Thomas Danmore popped up on one of the matches. She checked the vehicle registration of the 4x4 from the CCTV on the Connie Matthews murder, found it was listed under a Fred Mitchell. She dug deeper and found some records that showed that Mr. Mitchell had passed away around a year ago of a stroke. More digging revealed that Fred Mitchell had a sister, Jane Danmore, and here was when it clicked. Danmore was granted early release from the home at 16, as he was no longer considered homeless or dependent on the state. Because in that will, he was left a 4x4 pickup truck, and the deed to his uncle's pig farm.
Pig,
I whispered out loud, remembering the word Bethany Matthews drew in the dirt. That's right, she wasn't accusing the police. She was either talking about what that sick fuck wore on his face, or she was trying to write pig farm but passed out before she could finish, James speculated. He continued. Then, when we cross-referenced the only known pig farm in that area, No more than a 60 to 90-minute drive to Kansas City, Manhattan, Topeka, Lawrence, Clinton Lake. Well, it all made sense. When we were traveling down Highway 50, we arrived at the ambush site. Looking at the scene, finding the tracker and the bodies, we assumed you'd been taken, and we were too late. Then we got a report of a 911 call from a woman, calling from a number linked to a farm just outside Ponoma, owned by Thomas Danmore. That's when we knew you were there. James turned his palms up as if to say, so there you have it. I don't believe it. Fate. I chuckled at how all the pieces suddenly fell into place. James chuckled too. Well, can't fight fate. Our eyes met again and we shared another kiss as the ambulance made its way to the hospital. Chapter 14. 3 days had passed. I'd been given a clean bill of health for the doctors and sent home with a few stitches and some kick-ass painkillers. Myself and James were due to head back to Colorado and Texas respectively in one day. James had kept his promise to me, calling his friends in high places in the federal government to suggest it would be more appropriate for a third party to interview Hansen, given there's no way of knowing who else in the Kansas City PD may be dirty. In terms of Thomas Tuck Danmore, it would be highly beneficial for two highly trained criminal profilers with experience interviewing dangerous psychopaths to have first crack at him. And we were due to interview both men today. We arrived at the Kansas City Police Headquarters roughly just after 12:30 p.m. We walked through the entrance, pushing through the revolving door, and made our way into reception. It was here we were met with a thunderous applause. Desk workers, patrol cops, detectives, and the chiefs, all of them were clapping with gratitude for my bravery in the face of death and my insights that had helped in catching one of the most dangerous men to ever roam the Kansas state highways. I couldn't help notice a few, however, weren't clapping. They were either holding a cup of coffee or folding their arms, but they all had the same hateful scowl in common. I imagine these were the people who were in denial about Hansen's involvement with organized crime. Well, I resented their stares, but I respected their loyalty. On behalf of the people and the law enforcement of the state of Kansas, we once again thank you for your assistance in bringing another vile offender into custody. Not only did you give us the insights to crack the case, you showed the strength in the face of evil that makes every man in this room green with envy. Miss Ruth Maddock, everyone. The police chief then invited his colleagues to once again put their hands together in another show of gratitude towards me and James. Again, the majority complied, but the others sulked off into the background to get on with their day. No, I was just doing my job. It should be me thanking all of you guys. If you guys hadn't have done the work you did over the past few days, then Lord knows what would have happened to me. So honestly, thank you all. My heartfulness must have been apparent. Everyone smiled, and some, mostly the women, shed a tear. Right, back to it, guys. Thomas Danmore wasn't the first, and he won't be the last. The police chief watched as his team turned and retreated to their desks and offices. He then turned back to me and James. So, Miss Maddock, which of these pricks do you want to talk to first? The chief offered. I took a moment, but the truth is, I'd thought of nothing more than looking at that sadist fucker in the eye for days. Tuck, I need to confront him. Need to see him in the chair this time. It'll do me good, I told the chief. I noticed James gave me a concerned look. As I caught him, he quickly addressed the chief. What's Hansen said? Nothing much, but he does intend to plead guilty. Well, if what we have, a trial's a bad idea. His lawyer told him the same, the chief said confidently. He won't do a day in prison, though. Not with what he knows. He's a goddamn gold mine, James suspected, and the police chief scoffed and nodded facetiously. Yeah, he is, except he's refused every deal he's been offered, the chief revealed. Well, James's eyes widened in shock, and so did mine, to be honest. But he's a cop facing prison. Not a good situation to be in. Why wouldn't he bargain for immunity? I asked. The chief looked at the floor in deep thought and cocked his hat. Well, my guess is that the fear of informing on the people whose pocket he's in is much greater than the fear of going to prison, the chief speculated, a disturbing concept that had us all stood in silence. He's due to be taken from our custody to the county jail in a couple of hours, so try to talk some sense into him, eh? The chief requested. We'll see what we can do, Chief, James promised. The chief nodded with gratitude. He then turned and signaled for an officer to come over. Are Hanson and Danmore in the interview rooms? The chief asked. The officer nodded and gestured for us to follow him. We were led down to a lower floor under the police depot. A flight of steps led down to a single hallway. I couldn't help but get flashbacks to my visit with Robert Cassidy at the Hole in Florence. This was nowhere near as intense, however, but the layout was eerily similar. The cells, or cages, as I heard one of the officers call them, were on the left side of the corridor. The interview rooms were on the right. We were led to the end of the hallway, and the guard unlocked the last door. Give me a shout when you're done. I'll be right outside. Leave any weapons, phones, or anything sharp in this box, he told us. We thanked him, placed our phones, guns, and pens into the box provided, and the guard opened the door. Thomas Danmore, a.k.a. Tuck, was sat minding his own business, dipping a tea bag into his cup of hot water. His hands were chained to the desk, his waist shackled to the back of the chair. He looked quite content, in all honesty. I walked in, strutting, you might say. I wanted him to see me how he did when I was in that chair, knowing now there was nothing he could do. But, honestly, it was taking everything inside me not just to cry on the spot. James pulled out a chair for me. Tuck's eyes flicked to him as he did this. I sat down, and his eyes now fixated on me. He grinned, his cold eyes a glimpse into the heartless, sadistic demon that lay beneath him. Well, Ruth, I almost didn't recognize you there for a second with your clothes on. His tone was snide and derogatory. Funny, I didn't recognize you with all those chains on, with no control over me. I snapped back, reminding him who was on top now. His smirk weakened ever so slightly. A small victory for me. How about we skip the formalities? You just tell me what the hell it is you both want. 'Cause it ain't a confession you need. I'm guessing you found all the evidence you needed in my house and truck. James nodded subtly, with a fair enough facial expression. Whilst James and me had been going through the evidence at the motel and chasing down Hanson's false leads over the past few days, another girl had gone missing. 21-year-old Maisie Williams was driving back from university to visit her parents in Overland Park. Her car was found on the side of Highway 56, just outside Overbrook. The two front tires were burst. Forensics later determined it had been done by barbed wire. Forensics also found barbed wire in Tuck's barn, with rubber fibers found on the metal, matching the tires of Massey's car. They found her body, well, what was left of it anyway, wrapped up in a tarp in the back of the 4x4. Post-arrest interview between Thomas Danmore, Special Agent James Rodriguez of the FBI, and Professor Ruth Maddock from the University of Denmark. Interview commencing at 12:14 p.m., James said, after he pressed the record button on the machine. You're right. We're not here for the what, or the when, or the where. Your farm truck DNA in Clinton Lake is more than enough to put you away until you're nothing but dust or worm food. No, Mr. Danmore. What we're here for is the why. Why did you decide that one day you'd go on one of the most harrowing, bloodthirsty killing sprees this state has ever seen? Hunting, entrapping, luring, raping, torturing, murdering all these beautiful young women in the prime of their life? James's interrogation technique impressed me, backing Tuck into a corner, letting him know that no matter what he said, his situation wouldn't change, right before requesting for his side of the story, a chance to explain himself, or merely to brag about what he'd done. Why? Why? Tuck scoffed. 'Cause it didn't matter what I did, he added, leaning back in his chair and rolling his eyes. You know I heard the pathetic applause you got from down here. Congratulations to the both of you. But listen, I may be off those lonely highways now, but there'll be someone else. After you catch them, another one will take over. I wasn't the first, and I won't be the last," he declared. "So it sounds to me like you've encountered your own fair share of evil in this world, convincing you that you're either the prey or the hunter. Would that be fair?" I asked. Tuck's head snapped to me. His gaze drilled into my soul for just a few seconds. Every question I asked was going to piss this guy off. A constant reminder that I got away and the tables had been turned. He had no control over me, as long as I didn't let him. I met his gaze, and I stayed strong, like I knew I was. A few seconds later, his eyes returned to a neutral stance between the two of us, aimed at the table. "Yeah, you could say that, yeah," he muttered. "The outstanding government-funded facility that helps unwanted children find a new, loving home. The Lawrence Home for Boys," he added, a sarcastic tone to his voice. We'd prepared for this interview for the past 2 days. The interview was heading precisely where we wanted it to. "Tell me about Haley Stanhill. Did she do something to you while she worked at the home? Did she abuse you?" James probed. Tuck shook his head in disgust and disapproval. "Hell no. It was the men. The men came and they did what they wanted, to who they wanted," Tuck revealed. James and I shared an intrigued glance. "Sorry, what men? You mean the male staff?" I asked. Tuck grunted, shaking his head. "Visitors. But a lot of the staff were definitely either turning a blind eye to it, or most likely they were fucking in on it." Tuck kissed his teeth in resentment. "They said they were special visitors, people who could just help us get jobs and whatnot when we left. But we had to do everything they asked. Everything." Tuck cocked his head as he emphasized that last word. "And who were these people? Did you ever get any names?" James asked. "Yeah, but it was always something real generic and made up like Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones. White usually, middle-aged, all shapes, all sizes." "Did you ever tell anyone?" I asked, trying not to show a hint of sympathy in my voice. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. "Not me. Others did, though. Told some of the staff, and they reported it to the governor." "And?" "Well, those boys miraculously found loving families a few days later. Came to the home and said, 'We'll take 'em,'" Tuck exclaimed, theatrically. "I don't understand. Isn't that a good thing?" I asked, a little confused. Tuck scoffed. "Let's just say the families who came to collect 'em weren't families. In fact, they were always men. Men who looked just as wrong as all those special visitors who came to see us." Tuck's eyes were trying to guide us onto this train of thought. "So, what happened to them, in your opinion?" James asked. "I don't know. You tell me. You're the fancy federal agents. All I know is that the ones who got lucky, well, real families turned up for those kids. Dad wearing his nice Sunday best. Mom, the whole 'I cook pancakes for breakfast every day' thing going on. They always had that Flanders vibe to them, you know. But the ones who tried to speak up, they always went to the men. 3 or 4 of them, usually. These cold, hard faces. Not a hint of sunshine between them. Now, I ain't stupid. I learned real quick to keep my mouth shut. Unless Mr. Smith was telling me to open it nice and wide." We gulped. James looked at me. A while back I told him this job was depressing, because it showed me that evil creates evil, which creates evil, and the chain never stops. What Tuck was telling us right now only confirmed that. Haley was one of the good ones. She used to look after us. Best she could, anyway. One day I came to her with an injury. Bad anal tear, wouldn't stop bleeding. Told her what had happened, and she took pictures, for evidence and all that. Told me that she was going to the police. Went to this station and filed a report, apparently. Nothing ever happened, though. No one ever wanted to talk to me. And she left a few days later. Told us she was going on vacation, but she never returned. We was all angry. I was angry. She fucking lied to me. Police never did shit. Neither did she.
Tuck folded his arms and looked away in disgust. James's face began to contort, and mine followed suit. Something about what Tuck was saying didn't fit, and I shook away my puzzlement. So, hold on. Is that why you killed her? 'Cause she lied to you? I asked, hoping he'd clarify things. What happened next shocked us both. Tuck's face began to contort and actually matched ours. She's dead? Tuck gasped. Well, me and James were gobsmacked by his reaction. We'd planned this interview for days, and right now we had no idea where the hell to go with it. James pulled himself together and broke the ice. Yeah, we found her at the bottom of Clinton Lake with her boyfriend. Both had been beaten and tortured and then executed with a gunshot to the back of the head, stuffed in the back of her car and dumped in the lake. In fact, that's how we found you. Her employment at the home led us to you. We also found a couple of other bodies down there. Remains looked too old to fit your timeline, though. James laid out the findings, waiting for Tuck's input. And Tuck began to chuckle. There you go, you see. I was wondering why you two brought up Clinton Lake earlier. 'Cause I ain't never dumped shit in Clinton fucking Lake, he stated. The gravity of what he just told us shook us to our core. So if you didn't kill Haley, then who was your first human kill? I asked. Just some girl. Broke down on Highway 68 just outside Ottawa. Student, she said. She flagged me down. Don't know what made me do it, but thought she was pretty. Decided to make a move and make a pass at her. She slapped me and turned me down. I didn't like that. I'd already been taking my anger out on my uncle's pigs, seeing what made them squeal the loudest. Made me happy for a change, but soon I ran out of pigs. I was heading to the cattle market one day when I came across her. Susie was her name. I just decided to find out what the real thing felt like. Went from there, I guess. She's buried under the barn, in case you didn't already know. A girl named Connie was the second. Came across her broken down Jeep on Highway 70 near the gun club. She was a smart girl and a fighter, too. Didn't fall for the whole, I'll give you a ride to the nearest gas station routine. Made me chase her. Had to do her right there in the field. Well, luckily I had my tools with me. It was early in the morning, so it was quiet. No one heard her scream. Thought she'd given up. Bringing her back to the farm to bury her and all. And she made a run for it. I whacked her good with my wrench. Seemed to do the trick. I was dragging her back to the vehicle when I saw a few curtains twitching. Didn't have my mask, so I just had to split. After I left her, I didn't get caught, I started to like it. Made me feel invincible, you know. Tuck explained, nonchalantly. But traffic cameras showed your vehicle traveling fast, heading in the direction of Clinton Lake shortly after leaving Connie outside those flats. You turned onto the E600, I counted. Hell yeah. Didn't know who called what in. Could have seen my truck. Cops could be on their way. I needed to put some distance between me and whoever might be on my ass. I just thought cutting through Kanwaka would be better and quieter. Less eyes than Lawrence. Besides, I have to avoid that place like the plague, even on a normal day, as I'm sure you can imagine. Come on, think about it. Why would I even go to Clinton Lake? Didn't have the body anymore. We made a good point. Suddenly, we didn't give two shits about Tuck's why anymore. We really wanted to know the what, or, more accurately, what not. Tell me something. Do the names Juliet Knight, Maggie Donner, and Jessica Price mean anything to you? I asked. Tuck looked at me and shook his head. No. Who are they? Friends of yours? He scoffed. I didn't think so, I muttered, sweeping my hair back in a flustered manner. James pressed on, though, getting Tuck's attention. Mr. Danmore, these men, the ones who came to the home, you must remember them. Details about their appearances. James pressed. Tuck shrugged his shoulders before nodding. You don't forget people who do the things to you that they did to me. No, you don't, he said, pretty sure of himself. Listen, I'm not going to sit here and spin you some pipe dream by saying you could avoid prison, Mr. Danmore. It's clear you have to be off the streets. There's another case in the works, a series of incidents and deaths linked to a corrupt detective, as well as those men that attacked Miss Maddock on Highway 50. If Haley Stanhill complained to Kansas State Police about a child prostitution ring at Lawrence, and the next thing she turns up dead, well, there's a huge chance you could be a witness for the prosecution in the case of her murder. You could get a pretty decent deal out of this. Maybe even a minimum security hospital. Trial basis, of course. Does that sound like something you'd go for? There's a guy in the next room who's in just as much shit as you right now. You could both help us get the people behind this. James sold it well. Tuck seemed to nod along. Okay, Mr. Fad. You talk to my lawyer. I'll give them what I know. I'll think about what I want out of this. Tuck leaned back in his chair, a smug look on his face. Well, we nodded. We'll be in touch, we said, climbing out of our seats. The interview terminated at 12:35 p.m., James stated before shutting off the tape. Well, don't take too long. Hauling my ass out to county today. I don't want to be sat in some 8x9 with some wetback named Pedro any longer than I need to be. Cushy hospital gig sounds real nice now you mention it. He smirked as James banged on the room door. Seconds later, a guard let us out. We stood in the hallway, waiting for the guard to unlock Hanson's interview room. It's all starting to make sense now. When I read the post-mortem report on Haley, no signs of sexual assault, and shot in the back of the head. Not like a serial killer at all. He'd want to violate her and look her in the eyes when she dies. No, they were executed. She knew too much, I hypothesized, and James nodded in agreement. So, what do we have? An organized crime group dealing in sexual exploitation of women and children? Not to mention ambushes, attempted murder, conspiracy to commit rape. James reeled off the list. You think the gang behind Lawrence Home for Boys and Haley Stanhill's murder are the same gang behind the ambush on us and the murders of Juliet Knight, Maggie Donner, and Jessica Price? I asked. Well, guess there's one way to find out, James said, as he entered the interview room, with me right behind him. Chapter 15. Detective Hanson was the total opposite of Thomas Danmore. Neither man had requested the presence of a lawyer for these conversations, but Hanson still had a few favors here in the KCPD. He wasn't chained to the desk. His coffee looked hotter, and there was a half-eaten bagel on the table too. He wasn't sat down minding his own business. No, he was pacing, crawling the walls. Clearly the idea of going to prison was getting to him, being a cop and everything. James pressed the red button on the tape recorder. Interview with Mark Hanson. Please, Mr. Hanson, take a seat, James said, gesturing towards the other side of the table. That's Detective Hanson, he snapped back, demanding respect. It came across more like denial, though. I shook my head in disgust and squinted my eyes at his comment. Not anymore. You gave up that title when you colluded with organized criminals. To not only knowingly mislead our inquiry for weeks, but to conspire in murdering us both. You're so far from being a protecting and serving member of law enforcement right now. But you can be something else. Something that helps you and your Well, my pitch was cut short by Hanson pounding his fists into the table. I am not ratting. His eyes were wild, full of fear. He had that look for a few seconds before looking away in defeat. Not on these people, he muttered. You have a wife and 2 kids, Detective. You're the sole breadwinner. You think they can manage with you in jail? James attempted to reason. Hanson scoffed and shook his head. I am thinking of my wife and kids, Special Agent Rodriguez. You don't know what I know. Tell us who they are. Everything you know. And we could give you immunity and protection for your family, James assured him. Hanson shed a single tear. It was obvious he wanted to stay out of prison, but the fear in him was palpable. When it comes to them, there's no such thing as protection and immunity. He rolled his eyes in defeat and sighed with a hint of acceptance to his situation. He hung his head and stared at the floor. James and I turned to look at each other. Neither of us had anything to add. James nodded in defeat. Okay, that concludes this interview. Sorry you feel this way, Mr. Hanson. County Transport will be here to take you into their custody shortly. James hit the stop button on the recorder, and we started to get up. Oh, wait! Hanson's head lifted up to meet our gaze. James reached out to restart the recording, but Hanson grabbed his arm. No, leave it off, he demanded. Hanson then released his grip. He and James relaxed back into their chairs. I ain't going on record, he stated unequivocally. James held his hand up and nodded. I'm not a bad guy. I just didn't have a choice, Hanson swore. I couldn't help but notice he was a completely different person than the one I'd dealt with for the past 2 weeks. The arrogant, stressed-out front had gone. He was vulnerable now, completely congruent. We all have a choice, Detective, James responded. I made one mistake, and they've had me ever since. Hanson hung his head in shame. James and I shot him a confused look. Mistake? What mistake? I probed. Hanson looked up, tears running down his face. A long time ago, back when I was just a uni, me and my wife, we were having issues. Issues? Yeah, she'd just given birth to the twins. I was working long hours, stressed about money, stressed at work, and then coming home to, well, let's just say we lost the sanctity of our marriage pretty goddamn fast, Hanson explained. James gave a nod of empathy in response. So, what did you do, this mistake that you're talking about? Hanson turned to look at me when I asked the question, but he made sure to avoid my gaze when he answered. It was just meant to be just one time. Just wanted to blow off some steam, satisfy my urges, just one time. That's all it was meant to be. Hanson tailed off in a shameful sob. We didn't bother asking what. It was painfully clear. Her name was Cindy. She was beautiful. Wasn't like the other prostitutes I'd met. She was nice. Got to a point where I just wanted to see her every night, but, well, prostitutes cost money. Money I didn't have. Someone found out and blackmailed you with the affair, James presumed. Hanson bit his lip and shook his head. God, I wish that was the case, he sighed. We sat back and allowed him to continue. One night, about 5 years ago, back when I was just an officer, we were raiding a house in Victory Hills. We had a tip of being a suspected stash house, so me and a few other officers kicked the door in, arrested 5 males and 2 females. 3 of the officers had them pinned down, and it was up to me and one other man to search the premises. He found around 9 kilos of heroin and 7 kilos of cocaine. Me, well, found a compartment in the bedroom. In it was around $134,000, all in $50 and $100 bills. But if you check the evidence logs from that night, you'll find that only $120,000 was seized. Hanson let his confession sink in. Me and James rolled our eyes and shook our head in disappointment. $14,000. That'll pay off a lot of bills, Hanson stated, justifying his actions. A lot more meetings with Cindy, James added, and Hanson nodded. Well, 2 months later, I took a drive into the city, looking for Cindy. I went to her usual spot, but she wasn't there. Asked around, but everyone said they hadn't seen her in days. Hanson was holding back his emotions as he spoke. A few days later, I was at home. My day off, and my wife, well, she'd taken the twins out for a walk. A knock at my door. I answered. An independent courier handed me a package. Well, I found it strange because he didn't ask me to sign anything, and I hadn't ordered anything. I opened the package, and inside there was an unregistered cell phone and a USB pen. The vacant and disturbed look on Hanson's face evidenced his trauma inflicted by this event. He took a deep breath and exhaled shakily. I plugged the pen into my laptop.
There were 4 files on the stick. All but one were video files. I had no idea what they were, because all the video thumbnails were just black screens. So I double-clicked on the first one. Video began. The screen was black for a few seconds until someone who was covering the camera stepped a few feet forward and then stepped aside. Video showed a room. A warehouse or industrial building or something. I don't know where, but, well, there was a girl, hanging from the ceiling by her wrists, chained up like a piñata. Her mouth was taped, feet too. He swung his head, sucked in his own lips, trying to hold back more tears. It was Cindy. The 4 men stood around her, watching her kicking and screaming. He added, the tears had broken through now. Who are these men? What do they look like? James asked. Don't know. Wore balaclavas and ski masks. He was sobbing now, before continuing. They had bats and hammers, and they all took turns, till she stopped moving. They were brutal. His speech was nothing more than a whimper at this point. I'm sorry, Detective, I said sincerely. I didn't agree with his decisions, but he clearly cared for this girl, even if he was just a customer to her. Our video went on for a little longer, showing the man wrapping her up in a tarp, along with one of the hammers they used. I never knew what they did with her until those bodies turned up at Clinton Lake. So that's who the Jane Doe is, James asked, wide-eyed. Yeah, Hansen answered softly. I gestured for him to carry on. The video ended as they were loading the tarp into the back of a van. Play the next video. This began in a similar fashion, someone covering the lens until they took their finger away. The camera was a POV, and whoever was making the video, it was in my backyard. I watched as they finagled their way into my garage, took a hammer from the toolbox. Well, the video ended there. Went down to my garage, and lo and behold, I was missing a hammer. Hansen was now frustrated rather than upset. Third video again, lens covered, till a man leant back away from the lens. He was wearing a balaclava, and he used a voice distorter. I'll never forget those cold, dark eyes. He was in a room, like a back office sort of place. Nothing identifying anyway. God, I'll remember his words till the day I die. He said, Officer Hansen, I hope you enjoyed our money that you stole from us. Now, as you stole from us, you now owe us. I'm sure you've watched our little movie. Your bi-weekly 60-minute bumps with little Cindy are over now. We've seen to that. In the box, we've provided you with a burner. You'll receive a new one every week on your day off when your wife leaves the house. Burn the old sim as soon as you receive the new one. You see, in our line of work, it pays to have people in blue tipping the scales for our side. If you play ball, not only will your life be very comfortable, but your career will grow as well. And if you don't, well, the police will receive an anonymous tip as to where to find Cindy's body. They'll find her face and body smashed to pieces, the hammer that was used to do it, and, most importantly, your semen inside her. Oh, not to mention the countless witnesses who've seen her get into your car and enter your motel room every Tuesday and Friday night for the past 5 months. Not only that, but you'll have motive, too. Trying to hide a dirty affair from your wife. Motive means opportunity, DNA. Well, you're a cop, so I'm sure you know how cut and dry that investigation will be, don't you? And speaking of, I wonder what prison would be like for a cop. Can't be pleasant. And while you're inside, I'll make sure you're treated accordingly. And, on the outside, I'll make sure my boys sneak into your house in the dead of night and treat your wife and baby twins in the very same way. Think it over. The decision is yours, Officer Hansen. The video ended there. The last line was a folder icon. I double-clicked it. It opened the file, which was some sort of bespoke virus software, because it just erased my hard drive. And everything on the USB. So, I have no proof that I'm being blackmailed now, either. Anyway, got my first phone call 3 days later. Hansen pinched his nose in exhaustion.
He'd been carrying this for a long time. "What did they ask you to do?" James asked. Hanson shrugged and shook his head. "Well, nothing much at first. I was only an officer at this point. They give me tips, rival gangs usually. Fronts for money laundering operations, stash houses, brothels, you name it. I think they were expanding their territory. Oh, anyway, the man was right about my career. Around a year later, Detective Morrow, KC Homicide, he went missing, left a note saying he was sick of the job, sick of his life. Going to live out his days in Alaska. 4 days after they announced he'd left the station, got a call on my burner. They told me to apply for the detective position. I complied, and well, a week later, I was the new homicide detective for the Kansas City PD. It's like there was no competition, even though I knew 5 other guys had applied for that position. Some way more qualified than me, too. Well, that's when they started asking for bigger things from me. So, hold on. Things you're saying here, Detective. You're implying that there are others in positions of power and influence in the KCPD. Others like you. Hanson chuckled and scoffed at James's naivety. Politicians, councilmen, senators, yep, cops. Come on, Agent. What do you think was going to happen after you put the swarm away? They left a lot of real estate behind. Surely you didn't think someone wouldn't just move in, did you? A lot of powerful and dangerous people's wallets started to get a little tight, so... Yeah, Agent, I'm not no rotten apple. It's the fucking tree that's the problem. Hanson stared at us intently. I think that's how they knew I took the money in the first place. So, you know, I can't rat. My family will be dead within the hour. He hung his head then in reluctant acceptance. I have a question, I stated. Hanson gestured for me to go ahead. What do you know about the Lawrence Home for Boys? You were awful defensive about it back at my briefing. In fact, you made a point of directing me away from it as a line of inquiry. Not only that, but you also put considerable pressure on Officer Wilson to drop her investigation into the home. What's going on there, Detective? My eyes widened, my tone gentle. I wanted him to tell me. Hanson was struggling. He clearly felt disgusted by even being associated with this. Do you know how much money a large organization makes from drugs in a year? Around $1.2 billion, give or take. Do you know how much they make from guns? About $45 million. But the real niche, the one nobody wants to admit, is that the real money is in kids. The people who want to indulge in their sick and twisted fetishes, with no chance they'll tell anyone. Well, those people will pay a fucking shitload of money to do so. And the people who I work for, they'll protect it at all costs. I was honestly just trying to protect Sarah. And these people, He hesitated. They are ruthless and callous. I had no choice but to do what they asked me. James and I remained quiet for a few seconds, allowing Hanson to collect himself. Us too. What did they ask you to do, Detective? James asked, concerned. Got a call around 4 years back on the burner. Probably close to 5 years, actually. One of the first things they asked me to do as a detective. They told me that someone was talking about the home. They instructed me to go speak to her and find out what she knew. If it was too much, then I had to put something on her car. The tracker? James ventured. Yeah. Went up to her house, lied and told her I was from Vice and a liaison for the CPS. Took a statement. I could barely look her in the eye when she told me names, dates, times, descriptions. She even had a fucking photo of a young boy. And in that moment, I knew I had to do what I had to do. Just looking at that photo, I knew if I didn't do what they asked, I could be getting sent a photo just like that of my twins. So I did it. Left the house, and I stuck the tracker under the right wheel arch. The rest, well, had nothing to do with it. Next time I saw her was when I was hauling her car out of Clinton Lake 4 days ago. Hanson hung his head again, in guilt. Under the right wheel arch, just like you did with me. My tone was edgy and my eyes were narrowed in revulsion. You were getting too close. They wanted you out of the way. I was just thinking of your family. Yeah, you keep using that excuse, I snapped. Hansen didn't argue back. He just avoided my gaze. What were we getting close to? Where do Maggie Darner and Jessica Price and Juliet Knight fit into all this? Because we talked to Thomas Danmore, he says he's never heard of them, let alone murdered them, James asked. He took over the questioning, seeing how agitated I was getting at Hansen's self-pity over my kidnapping attempt. Dunno. All I know is that they were murdered and they told me they needed to be covered up. I was the lead detective on the Roadside murders. I suggested we could tie them to those murders. Didn't know it would all lead back to Lawrence. They told me the girls would be full of DNA from multiple people, all of which my employers didn't want found. So, yeah, I advised them to... He began to trail off, unable to finish the sentence. I told him to destroy her reproductive organs, make it hard to extract any DNA. Hansen was ashamed of himself. His whole body language made that abundantly clear. Well, James and I tried to remain professional. Thomas Danmore was a sick and depraved human being, but he was abandoned by people who were supposed to love us unconditionally, before being systematically abused and raped by people who were meant to care for him. It didn't excuse what he did, but violence and hate was all he knew. He was compelled. But the people who were blackmailing Hansen did it all for power and money. And people like that are much, much worse. James's face flinched as something came to him. "Who's Pablo?" he asked, curiously. Hansen looked at him, puzzled. "I don't know." "Come on, detective. This is off the record. Tell us," James pushed. Hansen had a blank expression whilst he shook his head rapidly. "No, I'm telling the truth. I honestly don't know," he pleaded. I slammed the tip of my finger on the desk to get the attention of Hansen. "We spoke to Jessica Price's friend. She said just before her death that she met a man. They were in a relationship of some sort. Said he was young, attractive, charming and wealthy, and his name was Pablo. Apparently he used to take her into the city on dates and nights out. When she died, he didn't even come to the funeral. We think he may have had something to do with her death. Maybe Maggie Darner and Juliet Knight, too," I explained sternly. Hansen took a moment to himself, staring at nowhere in particular. He seemed to be mulling over what we'd told him. His eyes widened in a moment of realization. He exhaled in a sort of scoff. "Pablo isn't a person, he's an entity," Hansen stated with a confident nod to himself. "An entity? Like a ghost?" James asked. Hansen shook his head. "Well, not in the way most people think of a ghost, but essentially, yeah. Pablo will be an alias or a pseudonym. I don't get to know the ins and outs of these people's business and how they work, but I've seen enough, given the things I've had to do and clean up. Knight, Price, and Darner, they're all young, attractive girls from damaged homes, easy to manipulate and led astray. These Pablos likely target these girls who are looking to escape their lives. They woo them with money, cars, and booze. Then, before they know it, they're being sold to the highest bidder, or worse." "Worse," James probed. "Come on, Agent. I saw that documentary on the Swarm. You know how much revenue there is in human trafficking in the dark web. Torture, gang rape, murder. Don't see why these people aren't capitalizing on that open market now. They were clear that the DNA in these victims could never see the light of day. They were more threatening than usual. Passing them off as Danmore's victims seemed the easiest way. I'm guessing whichever sickos had their private parties with these three were very, very important people. What I don't understand is how the fact the mutilation occurred post-mortem wasn't picked up by the coroner," I quizzed. Hansen shot me a look. "Let's just say he got his own little package in the mail." I hung my head and shook it in dismay. "But the bodies were found in 3 different counties. You saying they blackmailed them all?" James asked, confused. Hansen shook his head. "Just the one.
Then people in high places made sure he was the one on call that night. You have no idea the reach and power of these people. You're in over your heads, he warned us. Yeah, well, it's our job, unfortunately, so maybe you can fill in some other gaps for me. What happened to Officer Jim Knight? Apparently he died of a suicide because he couldn't handle what happened to his daughter. I'm inclined to think that wasn't the case now, James asked, suspiciously, his arms folded as he leant back in his chair. Hanson could barely keep eye contact. He just wouldn't let go. He was with me when we officially found the body. Well, he was distraught, obviously. Being a grieving father is one thing, but being a father of your only daughter whose mother died, then you throw in being a cop, and you have a hungry dog with a big juicy bone. He was looking into Juliet's friends, her acquaintances, her movements before her disappearance. Well, now you mention it, he did come to me and talk of a man she was seeing. He said he'd picked her up from the house a few times, but none of her friends had ever met him. This was likely Pablo, too, or another one of his men. He just kept pushing, bringing me evidence to go over. He started telling me I wasn't doing my job properly, and he was going to go over my head. Well, I had to make the call. To protect my... Oh, don't even say it. I cut Hanson off sharply. You had him fucking murdered. Blackmailed or not, you had a fellow officer killed and made it look like suicide. Hanson began to cry. But my sympathy was gone for him. There was a point where we all thought he was going to make it. Next minute, he's having a cardiac arrest. Wouldn't surprise me if they sent someone to the hospital to finish the job, Hanson said thoughtfully. Is that what happened to Jessica Price's father, too? Guy had been clean for a year, then all of a sudden he injects himself with enough heroin to kill a horse? Apparently. I demanded to know. Hanson shook his head. I have no idea. Swear to God, but if he was going around the city asking too many questions, I have no doubt they would have fixed him. Hanson had a disturbed look on his face once he'd finished talking, as if something had just come into his head. What? James asked him. You called the station, didn't you? Requesting to talk to me about those murders. Yeah, that's right. Well, I got a package that night. There's another burner and another tracker. The call came through in the morning. They said if you guys asked any questions about the girls or the families, then I had to put the tracker on your car so they could keep an eye on you. They didn't tell me anything else, I swear. If they were so worried about you talking to people about the girls and their families, then, yeah, maybe they did have something to do with that after all. Jeez, I muttered, shaking my head. Did you tell anyone that we requested a meeting with you regarding the cases? James inquired. No, I had no idea until they called on the burner the next morning, Hanson assured us. So, if anything, that simply further confirms that there are others in the KCPD who are in bed with these people, James speculated, and Hanson nodded his head in disturbed agreement. Well, before you ask, I have no idea where the Donner family are. After you called me, when you'd been up in Lexington, I didn't know what to do, so I called the number back on the burner. Told me you were pressuring me for an updated address. They didn't say a word, they just hung up. Then a couple of hours later, I got a text with the address in Homewood. They told me to send it to you. You have to believe me, they never told me what they were going to do. His eyes began to flow again as he reached across the table, his hands in a pleading prayer. I lunged them away. I didn't want him to touch me. Don't give me this shit. Maggie Donner, Jessica Price, Juliet Knight, Jim Knight, Cindy, Alan Price. All these people dead because they asked too many questions. What the fuck did you think they were going to do? Don't play ignorant or innocent. It doesn't suit you. I yelled in his face. I had completely lost it. Hanson recoiled in his chair in a fit of shame. His head fell into his hands and he began to sob. Sure you don't want to go on the record, Detective Hanson? James asked one more time. Hanson just shook his head and through his hands in a muffled voice simply said, I can't. I'm sorry. Detective Hanson, if you don't talk to us on the record, we can't protect you or your family. We can't control what happens to you in prison, James reiterated.
Hansen removed his hands from his face. His cheeks were red and flustered, his skin moist from the tears. "No, I've done a lot for them. If I go to prison, then they'll know I didn't talk. They'll respect that, I know it," he said in an almost delusional stutter. I scoffed before shaking my head at him, wearing a baffled smirk. "A cop in prison? You won't last a day. These people will know that. How long before they decide you're not worth gambling on, now that you're no longer any use to them?" I tried to get through to him, but it was no use. He just put his head back in his hands and sobbed. "Oh, goodbye, Detective. I hope you've made the right decision," James said, genuinely and professionally. We knocked on the door, and the guard let us out. Chapter 60. We made our way out of the basement floor and up to the main sector of the depot. As we were ascending in the elevator, I saw James was looking at me, concerned. "I'm okay," I assured him. "Sure? Because you got pretty heated in there. Even more heated than with the guy who had you tied to a chair, about to impale you with a rusty stool." "Why?" James queried. I took a moment of self-exploration, considering James's question. "Remember when I told you that sometimes I was tired of this job? Because it just shows me how much violence is in the world?" "I do." "Well, I think the most depressing thing is the fact that evil breeds evil. Robert Cassidy, he was beaten and raped by his father, who was likely abused by his own. Todd gets abused by the VIPs at Lawrence, goes on to kill 7 people that we know of. I think the reason I got so upset with Hansen is because he's protecting the sort of people who aren't just part of that chain. They likely started it. No, they don't rape or kill out of compulsion or psychological drive. They do it to protect their wallets. I don't know, it's just, that's worse somehow." I finished my explanation just as the elevator reached its destination. James didn't respond. He just placed a soft hand on my shoulder and smiled. We walked out into the main reception area. The chief spotted us and quickly rushed over. "Hey, did he talk?" he asked desperately. I was just about to say, "Not on the record," when James cut me off after, "Not a word, Chief. We sat in there for 30 minutes nearly, begging him to make a statement. But he wouldn't even let us leave the tape on." I didn't say anything. I continued to let James do all the talking. God damn it. Without his testimony, I have to take those 3 murders off the solved list. It's going to kill our stats for the quarter." The chief shook his head in disappointment. I had to stop myself doing the same. All these chiefs, all they care about is nothing except their image. The county jail transport will be here soon, so I better make sure they get the paperwork done," the chief said, before walking off. I waited until he was out of earshot before I turned to James and asked him, "You don't trust him, do you?" James shrugged. "I don't trust anyone in here anymore. They clearly had people on the force before Hansen, so that's how they knew he took the money. Also, it takes people in high places to fast-track a promotion to detective. I'm just saying we have to be careful what we say to people." "Agreed," I replied. The prison transport arrived around 30 minutes later. A blacked-out minibus rolled up outside the depot around 1:15 p.m. 4 armed men wearing body armor and donning dark helmets with blacked-out visors climbed out. They were sporting semi-automatic rifles, clearly no chances being taken. The entire department were out of their seats. Some were on the ground floor with me, James, and the chief. Others looked down from the second-floor balcony. When Dan Moore was being let out in chains, the entire department watched him loaded into the van with smirks on their faces. Some couldn't back whistling the tune to Hey, 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 Goodbye. Dan Moore turned to me and James just before he was pushed into his chair and shouted, "Don't leave me hanging now." Some of the officers gave us a few dirty looks. They judged us like, how dare we make a deal with this animal? However, when Hansen was being let out in the same manner, there was still the minority that didn't even stay to watch and instead stormed off, muttering under their breath. but the majority stayed, shaking their heads, some even going as far as to try and spit on him as he passed. He was aggressively loaded into his seat by one of the guards as another sign for the prisoners, officially taking them into their custody. Shortly after, all the men jumped in the van and headed to the county jail. The crowd dispersed and everyone went back to their jobs. James began ushering me over to a desk in the corner of the floor. "Here, I want you to meet the woman who saved your life." As I approached the desk, a uniformed female stood up and gracefully shook my hand with enthusiasm. "Oh, hi ma'am, my name's Sarah Wilson. Can I just say that I've admired your work ever since I heard about Frank Adams and Jim Mellor. I want to be a detective one day so that I can investigate serial killers like you. Hey, maybe one day we could work a case together." Well, I smiled at her enthusiasm. "I'd like that," I replied, honestly, with a friendly smile. I also told her that I admired her work on the case, given how it had saved my life and everything. We sat and talked about old cases, criminology, and academic advancement. She was a lovely woman, and I'd definitely love to work a case with her in the future, and I hope that happens. Moments later, however, the entire depot came to a stunned silence, as another minibus turned up outside the depot and another guard walked into the front desk. This man did not have the visored helmet. None of them did. The police captain, the chief, myself and James all rushed over to the front desk to ask what was going on. The man said the following. "Hey, sorry we're late. We were heading to the depot on Interstate 71 when we were held up by a roadblock. Some asshole had broken down in the middle of the road. I mean, how does that even happen? Well, anyway, we got out and helped him move his car out of the way, but it held us up around 15 minutes. Hey, the prisoners ready then?" The guard looked at us, wanting an answer, but all he received was a silent group of confused and disturbed faces. Epilogue. 3 weeks passed since that day. I returned to my permanent station at the university and got on with my own life for a while. James stayed back in KC, while his buddies from the FBI came down to investigate what had happened that day at the depot. I only had contact via a few texts from him until one night I got a call from James, telling me he was back from KC, and he was in Denver, and asked me if I wanted to meet him for dinner. His treat, of course. I agreed, as I was excited to see him again. We had much to talk about. Well, James looked as good as I'd ever seen him. This was the man Quince and Bodkins used to talk about. He didn't even look this good on the Netflix documentary, which I just had to watch. His skin looked fresh, his hair shaped, his palms steady. He'd kept his promise to me and stayed dry. I told him he looked well, and he replied with, "You don't look so bad yourself, Miss Maddock." We linked arms as we headed into the restaurant. We had wine and food, we laughed, flirted, and just had a magical evening. It was so nice to see what life can be about for a change, instead of so much rape, torture, and murder. James also seemed much more in control. I was a little against him sharing the wine with me, but he insisted. He had the one glass of red and didn't look like he was aching for more. He truly turned a corner, clearly. He told me that was down to me, and that made my night. We were halfway through our main course when I asked the burning question. "So, what's the situation in Kansas City?" James finished the last mouthful of peppercorn sirloin that he was currently chewing. "Well, they found the van just off East Truman Road on Blue Ridge Boulevard. It's in the middle of a field 200 yards off the road, completely torched. Hanson and Danmore's remains were inside when we got there. Postmortem revealed they had no fatal injuries, but they had injuries consistent with a beating. They were alive in the van when it was set alight," James explained professionally. "Oh, Jesus," I muttered. "I know, but given the circumstances, it's clear they knew when the prison transport was coming. They knew that either Danmore was going to talk about the abuse at Lawrence, or he was just collateral damage for Hanson. Either way, it shows they had access to inside information. So I passed on what Hanson confessed off the record to the deputy director." And the governors of Kansas and Missouri both been up for re-election next year, and both of them are promising the public that they're going to wage war on organized crime and corruption in public office. An official yet covert investigation is being opened in regards to our allegations. The governors requested to the director of the FBI himself that he help them clean up their cities. They've sanctioned a 6-week task force and is set to deploy in 4 weeks. The brief is to conduct a thorough investigation of the Kansas City Police Depot and other public offices under suspicion in order to establish high-level links between corrupt officials and organized criminals, James explained. Oh, that's great. Something needs to be done, I agreed. Then a curiosity came over me. Hey, while you were down there, did you ever hear what happened to Officer Stevenson? I asked. It had played on my mind since I saw that jar. Officially or, unofficially? James asked, his eyes somber. Officially, I asked for first. Well, officially he just decided to drive his car out in the middle of Independence, Missouri, and hang himself from a tree, James said, a hint of sarcasm to his voice. What? Unofficially. Well, given the tree that they found him was no more than 300 yards from where we found the van with Hanson and Danmore inside. I'd say that's significant. I mean, it's quiet. Not a lot of cars drive past there. Perfect place if you don't want any witnesses. Well, not only that, but his car had a shallow dent in the passenger side. Maybe from where he was run off the road. Well, maybe it was a lure to get him to exit the vehicle. Like to exchange insurance information. Anyway, because the family were taking some time gathering the funds for a funeral, I was able to look at the body. Let me tell you, I've seen enough murder victims in my time to notice some subtle defense wounds on the hands and knuckles when I see them. He took a final sip of his wine. But hey, the coroner ruled it a suicide. But the more I think of it, it makes a lot of sense, because I really don't think it's a coincidence we found the body all within 40 miles of the other Missouri deaths. Plus, it's the same coroner who examined the Knight, Price, and Donner murders. Thomas Campbell from Jackson County, James said, shaking his head. You're right. That's why they dumped the bodies where they did. So they could use their influence to control which coroner would examine the bodies, and ultimately could doctor the reports to steer the attention away from them. It wasn't too odd that Donner and Price were found where they were, as they both lived near where they were dumped, but Juliet Knight was always an anomaly to me. She was from Topeka and was last seen in that city. It made no sense for her to be dumped just outside of Wellington. My adrenaline was flowing with this realization. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm confident that's the case. My guess is Hanson found the pig picture in Stevenson's phone or emails, at the wrong end of the stick, and had him killed. Or worse, and unfortunately the more likely, Stevenson passed the information of the chain, and someone passed the order to silence him, back down. Either way, without Hanson to go on the record about the coroner being blackmailed, we can't make an official case against him. Yeah, it's pure speculation, and the body's been cremated now, James said, shrugging his shoulders. I guess that'll be the task force's job now, though, huh? James didn't say anything. He just smirked. What? I asked playfully. Well, actually, given my time on the Swarm case, they placed me as head of the task force, so I'm officially off administrative leave. Apparently, my assistance on the roadside murders, the investigation into the murders of Hanson and Danmore, and the fact my health is back in check, has put me back in the Bureau's good books. Well, like I said, I owe that to you, Ruth. Thank you, James said, sincerely. That's fantastic. But it was a team effort. I mean, you deserve to be back on top, I responded. James smiled and nodded. Yeah, it was a team effort, wasn't it? Oh, on that note, I pulled in a few favors, James said with a charm in his voice. Favors for what? I was more curious now. There's a place for you on the task force, Ruth, James stated with excitement. What? I exclaimed. But I have very little experience with fraud, corruption, and organized crime, I added. James shrugged and shook his head, waving off my concerns. True, but you've liaised with our outfit for years, helped to solve every case that you've been part of. You're a trained interviewer. You're practically a profiler, meaning you're a good judge of character, and you're already familiar with the task ahead.
Now, listen, Ruth, it didn't take much persuading at all to get you on board. You'll make a great addition to the team. Oh, and that's not all, James said, holding up a single finger as he reached back into his jacket pocket. I watched on with interest as James produced an ID badge from behind his back. He laid the plastic card on the table and slid it over to me. I looked down to see the words, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Ms. Ruth Maddock, Consultant. The valid from and to dates were the dates of the Anti-Corruption Task Force. You will be an official employee of the Bureau. You'll receive 2 weeks of basic training and 1 week of firearms training. You'll have a weapon, so the next time you get ambushed in the middle of nowhere by masked men, you will have your own weapon. Because if it wasn't for me being so cautious... Paranoid, I corrected him humorously, and James chuckled. Prepared for the worst, he corrected back with equal banter. And you wouldn't have had anything to defend yourself with, and without that, they would have... I cut James off. That was a lovely dinner, James. Let's not ruin it with horrible what-ifs, I suggested. Oh, and one more thing, James said, his smile so contagiously wide I could barely contain my own. Go on, I invited. Everyone is in agreement at the FBI that if those 6 weeks go well, then the next ID badge you'll get will say Special Agent. You'll be an official profiler, Ruth. You could work in the Behavior Science Unit, do what you do best. Or you could even join me. I'm set to transfer to Major Violent Crime after this task force is over. We go after the dirty cops in Kansas City for the next 6 weeks. Then we go after the drug cartels, the human traffickers, the child abuse rings, and whoever else tries to get rich off pain, violence, and force. We could make a real difference. What do you say? Well, he took me by surprise, I'll give him that. I'd been a professor at Denver for as long as I could remember. It gave me a chance to study the types of people who destroy women like me. It gave me a sense of power that I felt my research was helping catch them. Maybe it's the yawning teenagers through my lectures, or the fact I'm more likely to see someone checking their Twitter rather than putting their hand up, or, hell, maybe it's Cassidy. Maybe it's Danmore, maybe it's Quince. Maybe it's fucking everything, but for the past few years, I felt like I've done all I can to help the world from that post. I could do more. Much, much more. Oh, in Kansas, seeing Tuck sat across from me in that interview room, in chains. It felt good knowing I'd put him there. I finally had a physical representation of the difference I was trying to make. He couldn't hurt anyone anymore, and I made that happen. Perhaps this is what I needed. To be the one who puts these men in chains, and not just be the person who tells other men how they can do it. I say, let's change the world, I stated passionately. James raised his glass and I joined him in a clash of our glasses. It's been 3 weeks since that dinner. I was flown, all expenses paid, to Quantico, where I undertook a crash course in basic FBI field training. I wasn't allowed to conduct interviews or fieldwork alone, but James was right. I received a Bureau-issued Glock and a week's firearms training to go with. Right now, I'm on a plane to San Antonio, Texas. James and I are meeting up for another meal, so he can brief me on the case files of Operation Appletree. Given he's already been present at task force team briefings whilst I've been learning FBI 101s, like checking the corners of each room when entering guns drawn, well, before our plane leaves for KC tomorrow afternoon, I should be up to speed. Operation Appletree, the most robust and extensive FBI investigation into public office corruption ever sanctioned. Those were the words of the director of the Bureau during his team briefing of the task force members, according to James. I'm watching a news report on my laptop as the plane travels over the Kansas-Colorado border. It's the governor of Missouri, promising the people of the Sunflower State he's cracking down hard on gangs, drugs, and violence. He also promised to root out corruption in public office. He didn't tell the public, or the criminals for that matter, how it was going to happen, as our task force is completely clandestine. But it did truly beg the question, just how far would these criminals and dirty cops be willing to go to protect what they have?
Now, don't be too gutted that this series is drawn to a close, because James and Ruth are back next week in the first episode of Luke Hemingway's new epic crime thriller, as they lead a task force investigating the seedy underworld of downtown Kansas City. But as their investigation rolls on, they start to suspect that one of their fellow agents is a mole for the criminals they're chasing. Battling paranoia, betrayal, and brutality in full supply as we take a seat at the table for Operation Apple Tree. See you the same time next week. Till then, sweet dreams and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.